Chapter 15 of Jill the Reckless by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Jill Explains. 1. The lobby of the Hotel Cosmopolis is the exact center of New York, the spot where at certain hours one is sure of meeting everybody one knows. The first person that Nellie and Freddie saw as they passed through the swinging doors was Jill. She was seated on the chair by the big pillar in the middle of the hall. "What ho!" said Freddie. "Waiting for someone?"
"Hello, Freddie. Yes, I'm waiting for Wally Mason. I got a note from him this morning asking me to meet him here. I'm a little early. I haven't congratulated you yet. You're wonderful."
"Thanks, old girl. Our young hero is making pretty hefty strides in his chosen profesh, what?" Mr. Rooke, who appears quite simple and unspoiled by success, replied to our representative's inquiry as to his future plans that he proposed to stagger into the grill room and imbibe about $18 worth of lunch. Yes, it is a bit of all right, taking it by and large, isn't it? I mean to say, the salary, the jolly old salary, you know, quite a help when fellow's lost all his money. Jill was surprised to observe that the last of the Rookes was contorting his face in an unsightly manner that seemed to be an attempt at a wink, pregnant with hidden meaning. She took her cue dutifully, though without understanding.
"Oh, yes," she replied.
Freddie seemed grateful. With a cordial "cheerio," he led Nellie off to the grill room.
"I didn't know Jill knew Mr. Mason," said Nellie, as they sat down at their table.
"No?" said Freddie, absently, running an experienced eye over the bill of fare. He gave an elaborate order. "What was that? Oh, absolutely. Jill and I and Wally were children together."
"How funny you should all be together again like this."
"Yes, oh, good Lord."
"What's the matter?"
"It's nothing. I meant to send a cable to a pal of mine in England. I'll send it after lunch." Freddie took out his handkerchief and tied a knot in it. He was slightly ashamed of the necessity of taking such a precaution, but it was better to be on the safe side. His interview with Jill at the theater had left him with the conviction that there was only one thing for him to do, and that was to cable poor old Derek to forget impending elections and all the rest of it and pop over to America at once. He knew that he would never have the courage to reopen the matter with Jill himself. As an ambassador he was a spent force. If Jill was to be wooed from her mood of intractability, Derek was the only man to do it. Freddie was convinced that, seeing him in person, she would melt and fall into his arms. Too dashed absurd, Freddie felt, two loving hearts being separated like this and all that sort of thing. He replaced his handkerchief in his pocket, relieved, and concentrated himself on the entertainment of Nellie. A simple task, for the longer he was with this girl, the easier it did seem to talk to her. Jill, left alone in the lobby, was finding the moments pass quite pleasantly. She liked watching the people as they came in. One or two of the girls of the company fluttered in like birds, were swooped upon by their cavaliers, and fluttered off to the grill room. The red-headed Babe passed her with a genial nod, and shortly after, Lois Denham, the willowy recipient of sunbursts from her friend Izzy of the hat checks, came by in company with a sallow, hawk-faced young man with a furtive eye, whom Jill took, correctly, to be Izzy himself. Lois was looking pale and proud, and from the few words which came to Jill's ears as they neared her, seemed to be annoyed at having been kept waiting. It was immediately after this that the swing doors revolved rather more violently than usual, and Mr. Goble burst into view. There was a cloud upon Mr. Goble's brow, seeming to indicate that his grievance against life had not yet been satisfactorily adjusted, but it passed as he saw Jill, and he came up to her with what he would probably have claimed to be an ingratiating smile. "Hullo," said Mr. Goble. "All alone?" Jill was about to say that the condition was merely temporary, when the manager went on. "Come and have a bit of lunch."
"Thank you very much," said Jill, with the politeness of dislike, "but I'm waiting for someone."
"Chuck him," advised Mr. Goble cordially.
"No, thanks. I couldn't, really."
The cloud began to descend again upon Mr. Goble's brow. He was accustomed to having these invitations of his treated as royal commands. "Come along."
"I'm afraid it's impossible."
Mr. Goble subjected her to a prolonged stare, seemed about to speak, changed his mind, and swung off moodily in the direction of the grill room. He was not used to this sort of treatment. He had hardly gone when Wally appeared. "What was he saying to you?" demanded Wally abruptly, without preliminary greeting.
"He was asking me to lunch."
Wally was silent for a moment. His good-natured face wore an unwonted scowl. "He went in there, of course?" he said, pointing to the grill room.
"Yes."
"Then let's go into the other room," said Wally. He regained his good humour. "It was awfully good of you to come. I didn't know whether you would be able to."
"It was very nice of you to invite me."
Wally grinned. "How perfect our manners are. It's a treat to listen. How did you know that that was the one hat in New York I wanted you to wear?"
"Oh, these things get about. Do you like it?"
"It's wonderful. Let's take this table, shall we?" 2. They sat down. The dim tapestry-hung room soothed Jill. She was feeling a little tired after the rehearsal. At the far end of the room an orchestra was playing a tune that she remembered and liked. Her mind went back to the last occasion on which she and Wally had sat opposite each other at a restaurant. How long ago it seemed. She returned to the present to find Wally speaking to her. "You left very suddenly the other night," said Wally.
"I didn't want to meet Freddie."
Wally looked at her commiseratingly. "I don't want to spoil your lunch," he said, "but Freddie knows all. He has tracked you down. He met Nellie Bryant, whom he seems to have made friends with in London, and she told him where you were and what you were doing. For a girl who fled at his mere approach the night before last, you don't seem very agitated by the news," he said as Jill burst into a peal of laughter.
"You haven't heard?"
"Heard what?"
"Freddie got Mr. Pilkington to put him in the chorus of the piece. He was rehearsing when I arrived at the theatre this morning, and having a terrible time with Mr. Miller. And later on, Mr. Goble had a quarrel with the man who was playing the Englishman, and the man threw up his part, and Mr. Goble said he could get anyone in the chorus to play it just as well, and he chose Freddie. So now Freddie is one of the principals, and bursting with pride."
Wally threw his head back and uttered a roar of appreciation which caused the luncher at a neighbouring table to drop an oyster which he was poising in mid-air.
"Don't make such a noise," said Jill severely. "Everyone's looking at you."
"I must. It's the most priceless thing I ever heard. I've always maintained, and I always will maintain, that for pure lunacy nothing can touch the musical comedy business. There isn't anything that can't happen in musical comedy. Alice in Wonderland is nothing to it."
"Have you felt that, too? That's exactly how I feel. It's like a perpetual Mad Hatter's tea party."
But what on earth made Freddie join the company at all? A sudden gravity descended upon Jill. The words had reminded her of the thing which she was perpetually striving to keep out of her thoughts.
"He said he wanted to be there to keep an eye on me."
Gravity is infectious. Wally's smile disappeared. He, too, had been recalled to thoughts which were not pleasant. Wally crumbled his roll. There was a serious expression on his face. "Freddie was quite right. I didn't think he had so much sense."
"Freddie was not right," flared Jill. The recollection of her conversation with that prominent artist still had the power to fire her independent soul. "I'm not a child. I can look after myself. What I do is my own business."
"I'm afraid you're going to find that your business is several people's business. I'm interested in it myself. I don't like your being on the stage. Now bite my head off."
"It's very kind of you to bother about me."
"I said bite my head off. I didn't say freeze me. I take the license of an old friend who in his time has put worms down your back, and I repeat, I don't like your being on the stage."
"I shouldn't have thought that you would have been so." Jill sought for a devastating adjective. "So mid-Victorian."
"As far as you're concerned, I'm the middest Victorian in existence. Mid is my middle name." Wally met her indignant gaze squarely. "I do not like your being on the stage, especially in any company which Ike Goble is running."
"Why Mr. Goble particularly?"
"Because he is not the sort of man you ought to be coming in contact with."
"What nonsense!"
"It isn't nonsense at all. I suppose you've read a lot about the morals of theatrical managers?"
"Yes, and it seemed to be exaggerated and silly."
"So it is. There's nothing wrong with most of them. As a general thing, they are very decent fellows. Extraordinarily decent if you think of the position they are in. I don't say that in a business way there's much they won't try to put over on you. In the theatre, when it comes to business, everything goes except biting and gouging. There's never a law of God or a man runs north of 53. If you alter that to north of 41st Street, it doesn't scan as well. But it's just as true. Perhaps it would be more accurate to say that the golden rule is suspended there. You get used to it after you have been in the theatre for a while, and, except for leaving your watch and pocketbook at home when you have to pay a call on a manager and keeping your face to him so that he can't get away with your back collar stud, you don't take any notice of it. It's all a game. If a manager swindles you, he wins the hole and takes the honor. If you foil him, you are one up. In either case, it makes no difference to the pleasantness of your relations. You go on calling him by his first name, and he gives you a couple of cigars out of his waistcoat pocket and says you're a good kid. There is nothing personal in it. He has probably done his best friend out of a few $1,000s the same morning, and you see them lunching together after the ceremony as happily as possible. You've got to make allowances for managers. They are the victims of heredity. When a burglar marries a hat-check girl, their offspring goes into the theatrical business automatically, and he can't shake off the early teaching which he imbibed at his father's knee. But morals? Wally broke off to allow the waiter to place a fried sole before him. Waiters always select the moment we are talking our best to intrude themselves. "As regards morals," resumed Wally, "that is a different matter. Most managers are respectable, middle-aged men with wives and families. They are in the business to make money, and they don't want anything else out of it. The girls in their companies are like so many clerks to them, just machines that help bring the money in. They don't know half a dozen of them to speak to. But our genial Ike is not like that." Wally consumed a mouthful of sole. "Ike Goble is a bad citizen. He paws. He's a slinker and a prowler and a leerer. He's a pest and a worm. He's fat and soft and flabby. He has a greasy soul and a withered heart, and an eye like a codfish. Not knocking him, of course," added Wally magnanimously. "Far be it from me to knock anyone. But, speaking with the utmost respect and viewing him in the most favourable light, he is a combination of tomcat and the things you see when you turn over a flat stone. Such are the reasons why I am sorry that you are in his company." Jill had listened to this diatribe with a certain uneasiness. Her brief encounters with Mr. Goble told her that every word was probably true. She could still feel the unpleasant sensation of being inspected by the eye which Wally had compared, quite justly, to that of a codfish. But her pride forbade any admission of weakness. "I can take care of myself," she said. "I don't doubt it," said Wally, "and you could probably take care of yourself if you fell into a muddy pond. But I shouldn't like to stand on the bank and watch you doing it. I know what girls in the chorus have to go through. Hanging about for hours in drafts, doing nothing, while the principals go through their scenes and yelled at if they try to relieve the tedium of captivity with a little light conversation." "Yes," admitted Jill, "there has been a good lot of that." "There always is. I believe if the stage carpenter was going to stick a screw in a flat, they would call a chorus rehearsal to watch him to do it. Jill, you must get out of it. It's no life for you. The work." "I like the work." "While it's new, perhaps, but..." Jill interrupted him passionately. "Oh, can't you understand?" she cried. "I want the work. I need it. I want something to do, something to occupy my mind. I hate talking about it, but you know how things are with me. Freddie must have told you. Even if he didn't, you must have guessed, meeting me here all alone and remembering how things were when we last met. You must understand. Haven't you ever had a terrible shock or a dreadful disappointment that seemed to smash up the whole world? And didn't you find that the only possible thing to do was to work and work and work as hard as ever you could? When I first came to America, I nearly went mad. Uncle Chris sent me down to a place on Long Island, and I had nothing to do all day but think. I couldn't stand it. I ran away and came to New York and met Nellie Bryant and got this work to do. It saved me. It kept me busy all day and tired me out and didn't give me time to think. The harder it is, the better it suits me. It's an antidote. I simply wouldn't give it up now. As for what you were saying, I must put up with that. The other girls do, so why shouldn't I?" "They are toughened to it." "Then I must get toughened to it. What else is there for me to do? I must do something." "Marry me," said Wally, reaching across the table and putting his hand on hers. The light in his eyes lit up his homely face like a lantern. 3. The suddenness of it startled Jill into silence. She snatched her hand away and drew back, looking at him in wonderment. She was confusedly aware of a babel of sound, people talking, people laughing, the orchestra playing a lively tune. All her senses seemed to have become suddenly more acute. She was intensely alive to small details. Then, abruptly, the whole world condensed itself into two eyes that were fastened upon hers, compelling eyes which she felt a panic desire to avoid. She turned her head away and looked out into the restaurant. It seemed incredible that all these people, placidly intent upon their food and their small talk, should not be staring at her, wondering what she was going to say, nudging each other and speculating. Their detachment made her feel alone and helpless. She was nothing to them, and they did not care what happened to her, just as she had been nothing to those frozen marshes down at Brookport. She was alone in an indifferent world, with her own problems to settle for herself. Other men had asked Jill to marry them, a full dozen of them, here and there in country houses and at London dances, before she had met and loved Derek Underhill. But nothing that she had had in the way of experience had prepared her for Wally. These others had given her time to marshal her forces, to collect herself, to weigh them thoughtfully in the balance. Before speaking, they had signaled their devotion in 100 perceptible ways, by their pinkness, their stammering awkwardness, by the glassy look in their eyes. They had not shot a proposal at her like a bullet from out of the cover of a conversation that had nothing to do with their emotions at all. Yet now that the shock of it was dying away, she began to remember signs she would have noticed, speeches that ought to have warned her. "Wally!" she gasped. She found that he affected her in an entirely different fashion from the luckless dozen of those London days. He seemed to matter more, to be more important, almost, though she rebelled at the word, more dangerous. "Let me take you out of it all. You aren't fit for this sort of life. I can't bear to see you." Jill bent forward and touched his hand. He started as though he had been burned. The muscles of his throat were working. "Wally, it's..." She paused for a word. "Kind" was horrible. It would have sounded cold, almost supercilious. "Sweet" was the sort of thing she could imagine Lois Denham saying to her friend Izzy. She began her sentence again. "You're a dear to say that, but..." Wally laughed chokingly. "You think I'm altruistic? I'm not. I'm just as selfish and self-centered as any other man who wants a thing very badly. I'm as altruistic as a child crying for the moon. I want you to marry me because I love you, because there never was anybody like you, because you're the whole world, because I always have loved you. I've been dreaming about you for a dozen years, thinking about you, wondering where you were, what you were doing, how you looked. I used to think that it was just sentimentality, that you merely stood for a time of my life when I was happier than I have ever been since. I used to think that you were just a sort of peg on which I was hanging a pleasant sentimental regret for days which could never come back. You were a memory that seemed to personify all the other memories of the best time of my life. You were the goddess of old associations. Then I met you in London, and it was different. I wanted you. You. I didn't want you because you recalled old times and were associated with dead happiness. I wanted you. I knew I loved you directly you spoke at me at the theater that night of the fire. I loved your voice and your eyes and your smile and your courage. And then you told me you were engaged. I might have expected it, but I couldn't keep my jealousy from showing itself, and you snubbed me as I deserved. But now... things are different now. Everything's different, except my love." Jill turned her face to the wall beside her. A man at the next table, a corpulent, red-faced man, had begun to stare. He could have heard nothing, for Wally had spoken in a low voice, but plainly he was aware that something more interesting was happening at their table than at any of the other tables, and he was watching with a bovine inquisitiveness which affected Jill with a sense of outrage. A moment before she had resented the indifference of the outer world. Now, this one staring man seemed like a watching multitude. There were tears in her eyes, and she felt that the red-faced man suspected it. "Wally," her voice broke, "it's impossible." "Why? Why, Jill?" "Because... oh, it's impossible." There was a silence. "Because," he seemed to find a difficulty in speaking, "because of Underhill?" Jill nodded. She felt wretched. The monstrous incongruity of her surroundings oppressed her. The orchestra had dashed into a rollicking melody which set her foot tapping in spite of herself. At a nearby table somebody was shouting with laughter. Two waiters at a service stand were close enough for her to catch snatches of their talk. They were arguing about an order of fried potatoes. Once again her feelings veered around, and she loathed the detachment of the world. Her heart ached for Wally. She could not look at him, but she knew exactly what she would see if she did. Honest, pleading eyes searching her face for something which she could not give. "Yes," she said. The table creaked. Wally was leaning further forward. He seemed like something large and pathetic, a big dog in trouble. She hated to be hurting him. and all the time her foot tapped accompaniment to the ragtime tune. "But you can't live all your life with a memory," said Wally. Jill turned and faced him. His eyes seemed to leap at her, and they were just as she had pictured them. "You don't understand," she said gently. "You don't understand." "It's ended. It's over." Jill shook her head. "You can't still love him after what has happened." "I don't know," said Jill unhappily. The words seemed to bewilder Wally as much as they had bewildered Freddie. "You don't know?" Jill shut her eyes tight. Wally quivered. It was a trick she had had as a child. In perplexity she had always screwed up her eyes, just like that, as if to shut herself up in herself. "Don't talk for a minute, Wally," she said. "I want to think." Her eyes opened. "It's like this," she said. He had seen her look at him exactly the same way 100 times. "I don't suppose I can make you understand, but this is how it is. Suppose you had a room and it was full of things, furniture, and there wasn't any space left. You couldn't put anything else in it until you had taken all that out, could you? It might not be worth anything, but it would still be there, taking up all the room." Wally nodded. "Yes," he said. "I see." "My heart's full, Wally dear. I know it's just lumber that's choking it up, but it's difficult to get it out. It takes time getting it out. I put it in, thinking it was wonderful furniture, the most wonderful in the world, and I was cheated. It was just lumber. But it's there, it's still there, it's there all the time. And what am I to do?" The orchestra crashed and was silent. The sudden stillness seemed to break a spell. The world invaded the little island where they sat. A chattering party of girls and men brushed past them. The waiter, judging that they had been there long enough, slipped a strip of paper decorously turned upside down in front of Wally. He took the money and went away to get change. Wally turned to Jill. "I understand," he said. "All this hasn't happened, and we're just as good pals as before?" "Yes." "But," he forced a laugh, "mark my words, a time may come, and then...." "I don't know," said Jill. "A time may come," repeated Wally. "At any rate, let me think so. It has nothing to do with me. It's for you to decide, absolutely. I'm not going to pursue you with my addresses. If ever you get that room of yours emptied, you won't have to hang out a 'To Let' sign. I shall be waiting, and you will know where to find me. And in the meantime, yours to command, Wallace Mason. Is that clear?" "Quite clear." Jill looked at him affectionately. "There's nobody I'd rather open that room to than you, Wally. You know that." "Is that the solemn truth?" "The solemn truth." "Then," said Wally, "in 2 minutes you will see a startled waiter. There will be about $14 change out of that 20 he took away. I'm going to give it all to him." "You mustn't." "Every cent," said Wally firmly. "And the young Greek brigand who stole my hat at the door is going to get $1. That, as our ascetic and honourable friend Goble would say, is the sort of little guy I am." The red-faced man at the next table eyed them as they went out, leaving behind them a waiter who clutched totteringly for support at the back of a chair. Had a row, he decided, but made it up. He called for a toothpick. End of Chapter 15. Read by Don W. Jenkins. Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com. Chapter 16 of Jill the Reckless by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Mr. Goble Plays with Fate. 1. On the boardwalk at Atlantic City, that much-enduring seaside resort which has been the birthplace of so many musical plays, there stands an all-day and all-night restaurant, under the same management and offering the same hospitality as the one in Columbus Circle, at which Jill had taken her first meal on arriving in New York. At least its hospitality is noisy during the waking and working hours of the day. But there are moments when it has an almost cloistral peace, and the customer, abashed by the cold calm of its snowy marble and the silent gravity of the white-robed attendants, unconsciously lowers his voice and tries to keep his feet from shuffling, like one in a temple. The members of the chorus of The Rose of America, dropping in by ones and twos at 6 o'clock in the morning about 2 weeks after the events recorded in the last chapter, spoke in whispers and gave their orders for breakfast in a subdued undertone. The dress rehearsal had just dragged its weary length to a close. It is the custom of the dwellers in Atlantic City, who seem to live entirely by pleasure, to attend a species of vaudeville performances, incorrectly termed a sacred concert, on Sunday nights. And it had been 1:00 in the morning before the concert scenery could be moved out of the theater and the first act set of The Rose of America moved in. And as by some unwritten law of the drama, no dress rehearsal can begin without a delay of at least an hour and a half, the curtain had not gone up on Mr. Miller's opening chorus until 2:30. There had been dress parades, conferences, interminable arguments between the stage director and a mysterious man in shirt sleeves about the lights, more dress parades, further conferences, hitches with regard to the sets, and another outbreak of debate on the subject of blues, ambers, and the management of the spot, which was worked by a plaintive voice answering to the name of Charlie at the back of the family circle. But by 6:00 a complete, if ragged, performance had been given, and the chorus, who had partaken of no nourishment since dinner on the previous night, had limped off round the corner for a bite of breakfast before going to bed. They were a battered and a draggled company, some with dark circles beneath their eyes, others blooming with the unnatural scarlet of the make-up which they had been too tired to take off. The Duchess, haughty to the last, had fallen asleep with her head on the table. The red-headed Babe was lying back in her chair, staring at the ceiling. The Southern girl blinked like an owl at the morning sunshine out on the boardwalk. The Cherub, whose triumphant youth had brought her almost fresh through a sleepless night, contributed the only remark made during the interval of waiting for the meal. "The fascination of stage life! Why girls leave home!" She looked at her reflection in the little mirror of her vanity bag. "It is a face," she murmured reflectively, "but I should hate to have to go around with it long." A sallow young man, with the alertness peculiar to those who work on the night shifts of restaurants, dumped a tray down on the table with a clatter. The Duchess woke up. Babe took her eyes off the ceiling. The Southern girl ceased to look at the sunshine. Already, at the mere sight of food, the extraordinary recuperative powers of the theatrical worker had begun to assert themselves. In 5 minutes these girls would be feeling completely restored and fit for anything. Conversation broke out with the first sip of coffee, and the calm of the restaurant was shattered. Its day had begun. "It's a great life if you don't weaken," said the Cherub hungrily, attacking her omelette. "And the worst is yet to come. I suppose all you old dears realize that this show will have to be rewritten from end to end, and we'll be rehearsing day and night all the time we're on the road." "Why?" Lois Denham spoke with her mouth full. "What's wrong with it?" The Duchess took a sip of coffee. "Don't make me laugh," she pleaded. "What's wrong with it? What's right with it, one would feel more inclined to ask." "One would feel still more inclined," said the Cherub, "to ask why one was such a chump as to let oneself in for this sort of thing when one hears on all sides that waitresses earn $60 a month." "The numbers are all right," argued Babe. "I don't mean the melodies, but Johnny has arranged some good business." "He always does," said the Southern girl. "Some more buckwheat cakes, please." "But what about the book?" "I never listened to the book." The Cherub laughed. "You're too good to yourself. I listened to it right along, and take it from me, it's sad. Of course they'll have it fixed. We can't open in New York like this. My professional reputation wouldn't stand it. Didn't you see Wally Mason in front making notes? They've got him down to do the rewriting." Jill, who had been listening in a dazed way to the conversation, fighting against the waves of sleep which flooded over her, woke up. Was Mr. Mason there?" "Sure, sitting at the back." Jill could not have said whether she was glad or sorry. She had not seen Wally since that afternoon when they had lunched together at the Cosmopolis, and the rush of the final weeks of rehearsals had given her little opportunity for thinking of him. At the back of her mind had been the feeling that sooner or later she would have to think of him, but for 2 weeks she had been too tired and too busy to re-examine him as a factor in her life. There had been times when the thought of him had been like the sunshine on a winter day, warming her with almost an impersonal glow in moments of depression. And then some sharp, poignant memory of Derek would come to blot him out. She came out of her thoughts to find that the talk had taken another turn.
"And the worst of it is," the Cherub was saying, "we shall rehearse all day and give a show every night and work ourselves to the bone, and then, when they're good and ready, they'll fire one of us." "That's right," agreed the Southern girl. "They couldn't," Jill cried. "You wait," said the Cherub. "They'll never open in New York with 13 girls. Mike's much too superstitious." "But they wouldn't do a thing like that after we've all worked so hard." There was a general burst of sardonic laughter. Jill's opinion of the chivalry of theatrical managers seemed to be higher than that of her more experienced colleagues. "They'll do anything," the Cherub assured her. "You don't know the half of it, dearie," scoffed Lois Denham. "You don't know the half of it." "Wait till you've been in as many shows as I have," said Babe, shaking her red locks. "The usual thing is to keep a girl slaving her head off all through the road tour, and then fire her before the New York opening." "But it's a shame. It isn't fair." "If one is expecting to be treated fairly," said the Duchess with a prolonged yawn, "one should not go into the show business." And having uttered this profoundly true maxim, she fell asleep again. The slumber of the Duchess was the signal for a general move. Her somnolence was catching. The restorative effects of the meal were beginning to wear off. There was a call for a chorus rehearsal at 4 o'clock, and it seemed the wise move to go to bed and get some sleep while there was time. The Duchess was roused from her dreams by means of a piece of ice from one of the tumblers. Bills were paid, and the company poured out, yawning and chattering, into the sunlight of the empty sidewalk. Jill detached herself from the group and made her way to a seat facing the sea. Tiredness had fallen upon her like a leaden weight, crushing all the power out of her limbs. And the thought of walking to the boarding house where, from motives of economy, she was sharing a room with the Cherub, paralyzed her. It was a perfect morning, clear and cloudless, with the warm freshness of a day that means to be hotter later on. The sea sparkled in the sun. Little waves broke lazily on the gray sand. Jill closed her eyes, for the brightness of the sun and water was trying, and her thoughts went back to what the Cherub had said. If Wally was really going to rewrite the play, they would be thrown together. She would be obliged to meet him, and she was not sure that she was ready to meet him. Still, he would be somebody to talk to on subjects other than the one eternal topic of the theater, somebody who belonged to the old life. She had ceased to regard Freddie Rooke in this light, for Freddie, solemn with his new responsibilities as a principal, was the most whole-hearted devotee of shop in the company. Freddie nowadays declined to consider any subject for conversation that did not have to do with the Rose of America in general and his share of it in particular. Jill had given him up, and he had paired off with Nellie Bryant. The two were inseparable. Jill had taken 1 or 2 meals with them, but Freddie's professional monologues, of which Nellie seemed never to weary, were too much for her. As a result, she was now very much alone. There were girls in the company whom she liked, but most of them had their own intimate friends, and she was always conscious of not being really wanted. She was lonely, and, after examining the matter as clearly as her tired mind would allow, she found herself curiously soothed by the thought that Wally would be near to mitigate her loneliness. She opened her eyes, blinking. Sleep had crept upon her with an insidious suddenness, and she had almost fallen over on the seat. She was just bracing herself to get up and begin the long tramp to the boarding house when a voice spoke at her side. "Hullo, good morning." Jill looked up. "Hullo, Wally." "Surprised to see me?" "No. Millie Trevor said she had seen you at the rehearsal last night." Wally came round the bench and seated himself at her side. His eyes were tired and his chin dark and bristly. "Had breakfast?" "Yes, thanks. Have you?" "Not yet. How are you feeling?" "Rather tired." "I wonder you're not dead. I've been through a good many dress rehearsals, and this one was the record. Why they couldn't have had it comfortably in New York and just have run through the piece without scenery last night, I don't know, except that in musical comedy it's etiquette always to do the most inconvenient thing. They know perfectly well that there was no chance of getting the scenery into the theater till the small hours. You must be worn out. Why aren't you in bed?" "I couldn't face the walk. I suppose I ought to be going, though." She half rose, then sank back again. The glitter of the water hypnotized her. She closed her eyes again. She could hear Wally speaking. Then his voice grew suddenly faint and far off, and she ceased to fight the delicious drowsiness. Jill awoke with a start. She opened her eyes and shut them again at once. The sun was very strong now,
It was one of those prematurely warm days of early spring which have all the languorous heat of late summer. She opened her eyes once more and found that she was feeling greatly refreshed. She also discovered that her head was resting on Wally's shoulder.
"Have I been asleep?"
Wally laughed. "You have been having what you might call a nap." He massaged his left arm vigorously. "You needed it. Do you feel more rested now?"
"Good gracious! Have I been squashing your poor arm all the time? Why didn't you move?"
"I was afraid you would fall over. You just shut your eyes and toppled sideways."
"What's the time?"
Wally looked at his watch. "Just on 10?"
10?
Jill was horrified.
Why, I have been giving you a cramp for about 3 hours. You must have had an awful time."
"Oh, it was all right. I think I dozed off myself. Except that the birds didn't come and cover us with leaves. It was rather like Babes in the Wood."
"But you haven't had any breakfast. Aren't you starving?"
"Well, I'm not saying I wouldn't spear a fried egg with some vim if it happened to float past. But there's plenty of time for that. Lots of doctors say you oughtn't to eat breakfast, and Indian fakirs go without food for days at a time in order to develop their souls. Shall I take you back to wherever you're staying? You ought to get a proper sleep in bed."
"Don't dream of taking me. Go off and have something to eat."
"Oh, that can wait. I'd like to see you safely home." Jill was conscious of a renewed sense of his comfortingness. There was no doubt about it. Wally was different from any other man she had known. She suddenly felt guilty, as if she were obtaining something valuable under false pretenses.
"Wally?"
"Hullo."
You oughtn't to be so good to me."
"Nonsense. Where's the harm in lending a hand, or rather an arm, to a pal in trouble?"
"You know what I mean. I can't... That is to say, it isn't as though... I mean..."
Wally smiled a tired, friendly smile. "If you're trying to say what I think you're trying to say, don't. We had all that out 2 weeks ago. I quite understand the position. You mustn't worry yourself about it." He took her arm and they crossed the boardwalk. "Are we going in the right direction? You lead the way. I know exactly how you feel. We're old friends and nothing more. But as an old friend I claim the right to behave like an old friend. If an old friend can't behave like an old friend, how can an old friend behave? And now we'll rule the whole topic out of the conversation. But perhaps you're too tired for conversation?"
"Oh, no."
"Then I will tell you about the sad death of Mr. Pilkington."
"What?"
"Well, when I say death, I use the word in a loose sense. The human giraffe still breathes, and I imagine from the speed with which he legged it back to his hotel when we parted that he still takes nourishment. But really he is dead. His heart is broken. We had a conference after the dress rehearsal, and our friend Mr. Goble told him in no uncertain words in the whole course of my experience I have never heard words less uncertain that his damned rotten highbrow false alarm of a show I am quoting Mr. Goble would have to be rewritten by alien hands. And these are them. On the right alien, right hand. On the left alien, left hand. Yes, I am the instrument selected for the murder of Pilkington's artistic aspirations. I'm going to rewrite the show. In fact, I have already rewritten the first act and most of the second. Goble foresaw this contingency and told me to get busy 2 weeks ago, and I've been working hard ever since. We shall start rehearsing the new version tomorrow and open in Baltimore next Monday with practically a different piece. And it's going to be a pippin, believe me," said our hero modestly. "A gang of composers has been working in shifts for 2 weeks, and by chucking out nearly all of the original music we shall have a good score. It means a lot of work for you, I'm afraid. All the business of the numbers will have to be rearranged."
"I like work," said Jill, "but I'm sorry for Mr. Pilkington."
"He's all right. He owns 70% of the show. He may make a fortune. He's certain to make a comfortable sum. That is, if he doesn't sell out his interest in Peak, or Dudgeon, if you prefer it. From what he said at the close of the proceedings, I fancy he would sell out to anybody who asked him. At least, he said that he washed his hands of the piece. He's going back to New York this afternoon. Won't even wait for the opening. Of course, I'm sorry for the poor chap in a way, but he had no right, with the excellent central idea which he got, to turn out such a rotten book. Oh, by the way."
"Yes?"
"Another tragedy. Unavoidable, but pathetic. Poor old Freddie. He's out."
"Oh, no."
"Out," repeated Wally firmly.
"But didn't you think he was good last night?"
"He was awful. But that isn't why. Goble wanted his part rewritten as a Scotchman, so as to get McAndrew, the fellow who made such a hit last season in Hootsman. That sort of thing is always happening in musical comedy. You have to fit parts to suit whatever good people happen to be available at the moment. My heart bleeds for Freddie, but what can one do? At any rate, he isn't so badly off as a fellow was in one of my shows. In the second act he was supposed to have escaped from an asylum, and the management, in a passion for realism, insisted that he should shave his head. The day after he shaved it, they heard that a superior comedian was disengaged and fired him. It's a ruthless business."
"The girls were saying that one of us would be dismissed."
"Oh, I shouldn't think that's likely."
"I hope not."
"So do I. What are we stopping for?" Jill had halted in front of a shabby-looking house, one of those depressed buildings which spring up overnight at seashore resorts and start to decay the moment the builders have left them.
"I live here."
"Here?" Wally looked at her in consternation. "But..."
Jill smiled. "We working girls have got to economize. Besides, it's quite comfortable, fairly comfortable, inside, and it's only for a week."
She yawned.
"I believe I'm falling asleep again. I'd better hurry in and go to bed. Good-bye, Wally dear. You've been wonderful. Mind you go and get a good breakfast."
2. When Jill arrived at the theatre at 4 o'clock for the chorus rehearsal, the expected blow had not fallen. No steps had apparently been taken to eliminate the 13th girl whose presence in the cast preyed on Mr. Goble's superstitious mind. But she found her colleagues still in a condition of pessimistic foreboding. "Wait" was the gloomy watchword of the Rose of America chorus. The rehearsal passed off without event. It lasted until 6 o'clock, when Jill, the Cherub, and 2 or 3 of the other girls went up to snatch a hasty dinner before returning to the theatre to make up. It was not a cheerful meal. Reaction had set in after the overexertion of the previous night, and it was too early for first-night excitement to take its place. Everybody, even the Cherub, whose spirits seldom failed her, was depressed, and the idea of an overhanging doom had grown. It seemed now to be merely a question of speculating on the victim, and the conversation gave Jill, as the last addition to the company, and so the cause of swelling the ranks of the chorus, to be the unlucky number, a feeling of guilt. She was glad when it was time to go back to the theatre. The moment she and her companions entered the dressing-room, it was made clear to them that the doom had fallen. In a chair in the corner, all her pretense and affection swept away in a flood of tears, sat the unhappy Duchess, the centre of a group of girls anxious to console, but limited in their ideas of consolation to an occasional pat on the back and an offer of a fresh pocket-handkerchief. "It's tough, honey," someone was saying as Jill came in. Somebody else said it was fierce, and a third girl declared it to be the limit. A fourth girl, well-meaning but less helpful than she would have liked to be, was advising the victim not to worry. The story of the disaster was brief and easily told. The Duchess, sailing in at the stage door, had paused at the letter box to see if Cuthbert, her faithful auto salesman, had sent her a good luck telegram. He had, but his good wishes were unfortunately neutralized by the fact that the very next letter in the box was one from the management, crisp and to the point, informing the Duchess that her services would not be required that night or thereafter. It was the subtle meanness of the blow that roused the indignation of the Rose of America chorus, the cunning villainy with which it had been timed.
"Poor May, if she'd opened tonight, they'd have had to give her 2 weeks' notice or her salary. But they can fire her without a cent just because she's only been rehearsing and hasn't given a show." The Duchess burst into a fresh flood of tears. "Don't you worry, honey," advised the well-meaning girl who would have been in her element looking in on Job with Bildad and Shuhite and his friends. "Don't you worry."
"It's tough," said the girl who had adopted that form of verbal consolation. "It's fierce," said the girl who preferred that adjective. The other girl, with an air of saying something new, repeated her statement that it was the limit. The Duchess cried forlornly throughout. She had needed this engagement badly. Chorus salaries are not stupendous, but it is possible to save money by means of them during a New York run, especially if you have spent 3 years in a milliner's shop and can make your own clothes, as the Duchess, in spite of her air of being turned out by Fifth Avenue modistes, could and did. She had been looking forward, now, as this absurd piece was to be rewritten by somebody who knew his business and had a good chance of success, to putting by just those few dollars that make all the difference when you are embarking on married life. Cuthbert, for all his faithfulness, could not hold up the financial end of the establishment unsupported for at least another 18 months. And this disaster meant that the wedding would have to be postponed again. So the Duchess, abandoning that aristocratic manner criticized by some of her colleagues as upstage and by others as ritzy, sat in her chair and consumed pocket handkerchiefs as fast as they were offered to her. Jill had been the only girl in the room who had spoken no word of consolation. This was not because she was not sorry for the Duchess. She had never been sorrier for anyone in her life. The pathos of that swift descent from haughtiness to misery had bitten deep into her sensitive heart. But she revolted at the idea of echoing the banal words of others. Words were no good, she thought, as she set her little teeth and glared at an absent management, a management just about now presumably distending itself with a luxurious dinner at one of the big hotels. Deeds were what she demanded. All her life she had been a girl of impulsive action, and she wanted to act impulsively now. She was in much the same berserk mood as had swept her raging to the defence of Bill the Parrot on the occasion of his dispute with Henry of London. The fighting spirit which had been drained from her by the all-night rehearsal had come back in full measure. "What are you going to do?" she cried. "Aren't you going to do something?" Do? The members of the Rose of America ensemble looked doubtfully at one another. Do? It had not occurred to them that there was anything to be done. These things happened and you regretted them, but as for doing anything, well, what could you do? Jill's face was white and her eyes were flaming. She dominated the roomful of girls like a little Napoleon. The change in her startled them. Hitherto they had always looked on her as rather an unusually quiet girl. She had always made herself unobtrusively pleasant to them all. They all liked her. They had never suspected her of possessing this militant quality. Nobody spoke. But there was a general stir. She had flung a new idea broadcast, and it was beginning to take root. Do something. Well, if it came to that, why not? "We ought all to refuse to go on tonight unless they let her go on," Jill declared. The stir became a movement. Enthusiasm is catching, and every girl is at heart a rebel. And the idea was appealing to the imagination. Refuse to give a show on the opening night. Had a chorus ever done such a thing? They trembled on the verge of making history. "Strike?" quavered somebody at the back. "Yes, strike!" cried Jill. "Hooray! That's the stuff!" shouted the Cherub, and turned the scale. She was a popular girl, and her adherence to the cause confirmed the doubters. "Strike! Strike! Strike!" Jill turned to the Duchess, who had been gaping amazedly at the demonstration. She no longer wept, but she seemed in a dream. "Dress and get ready to go on," Jill commanded. "We'll all dress and get ready to go on. Then I'll go and find Mr. Goble and tell him what we mean to do. And if he doesn't give in, we'll stay here in this room and there won't be a performance." 3. Mr. Goble, with a derby hat on the back of his head and an unlighted cigar in the corner of his mouth, was superintending the erection of the first act set when Jill found him. He was standing with his back to the safety curtain, glowering at a blue canvas, supposed to represent one of those picturesque summer skies which you get at the best places on Long Island. Jill, coming downstage from the staircase that led to the dressing room, interrupted his line of vision. "Get out of the light!" bellowed Mr. Goble, always a man of direct speech, adding, "Damn you!" for good measure. "Please move to one side," interpreted the stage director. "Mr. Goble is looking at the set." The head carpenter, who completed the little group, said nothing. Stage carpenters always say nothing. Long association with fussy directors has taught them that the only policy to pursue on opening night is to withdraw into silence, wrap themselves up in it, and not emerge until the enemy has grown tired and gone off to worry somebody else. "It don't look right," said Mr. Goble, cocking his head on one side. "I see what you mean, Mr. Goble," assented the stage director obsequiously. "It has perhaps a little too much, not quite enough. Yes, I see what you mean." "It's too damn blue," rasped Mr. Goble, impatient of the vacillating criticism. "That's what's the matter with it." The head carpenter abandoned the silent policy of a lifetime. He felt impelled to utter. He was a man who, when not at the theatre, spent most of his time in bed reading all fiction magazines. But it so happened that once, last summer, he had actually seen the sky, and he considered that this entitled him to speak almost as a specialist on the subject. "The sky is blue," he observed huskily. "Yes, sir, I seen it." He passed into the silence again, and to prevent a further lapse, stopped up his mouth with a piece of chewing gum. Mr. Goble regarded the silver-tongued orator wrathfully. He was not accustomed to chatterboxes arguing with him like this. He would probably have said something momentous and crushing, but at this point Jill intervened. "Mr. Goble." The manager swung round to her. "What is it?" It is sad to think how swiftly affection can change to dislike in this world. 2 weeks before, Mr. Goble had looked on Jill with favour. She had seemed good in his eyes. But that refusal of hers to lunch with him, followed by a refusal some days later to take a bit of supper somewhere, had altered his views on feminine charm. If it had been left to him, as most things were about this theatre, to decide which of the 13 girls should be dismissed, he would undoubtedly have selected Jill. But at this stage in the proceedings there was the unfortunate necessity of making concessions to the temperamental Johnson Miller. Mr. Goble was aware that the dance director's services would be badly needed in the rearrangement of the numbers during the coming week or so, and he knew that there were a dozen managers waiting eagerly to welcome him if he threw up his present job. So he had been obliged to approach him in quite a humble spirit and inquire which of his female chorus would be most easily spared. And as the Duchess had a habit of carrying her haughty languor onto the stage and employing it as a substitute for the chorea which was Mr. Miller's ideal, the dance director had chosen her. To Mr. Goble's dislike of Jill, therefore, was added now something of the fury of the baffled potentate. "D'ja want?" he demanded. "Mr. Goble is extremely busy," said the stage director. "Extremely." A momentary doubt as to the best way of approaching her subject had troubled Jill on her way downstairs, but now that she was on the battlefield confronting the enemy, she found herself cool, collected, and full of a cold rage which steeled her nerves without confusing her mind. "I came to ask you to let May D'Arcy go on tonight." "Who the hell's May D'Arcy?" Mr. Goble broke off to bellow at a scene shifter who was depositing the wall of Mrs. Stuyvesant Van Dyke's Long Island residence too far downstage. "Not there, you fool! Higher up!" "You gave her notice this evening," said Jill. "Well, what about it?" "We want you to withdraw it." "Who's we?" "The other girls and myself." Mr. Goble jerked his head so violently that the derby hat flew off, to be picked up, dusted, and restored by the stage director. "Oh, so you don't like it? Well, you know what you can do." "Yes," said Jill, "we do. We are going to strike." "What?" "If you don't let May go on, we shan't go on. There won't be a performance tonight unless you like to give one without a chorus." "Are you crazy?" "Perhaps, but we're quite unanimous." Mr. Goble, like most theatrical managers, was not good at words over 2 syllables. "You're what?" "We've talked it over, and we've all decided to do what I said." Mr. Goble's hat shot off again and gambolled all the way into the wings, with the stage director bounding after it like a retriever. "Whose idea is this?" demanded Mr. Goble. His eyes were a little foggy, for his brain was adjusting itself but slowly to the novel situation. "Mine." "Oh, yours. I thought as much." "Well," said Jill, "I'll go back and tell them that you will not do what we ask. We shall keep our make-up on in case you change your mind." She turned away. "Come back!" Jill proceeded toward the staircase. As she went, a husky voice spoke in her ear. "Go to it, kid. You're all right." The head carpenter had broken his Trappist vows twice in a single evening, a thing which had not happened to him since the night 3 years ago, when, sinking wearily into a seat in a dark corner for a bit of rest, he found that one of his assistants had placed a pot of red paint there. 4. To Mr. Goble, fermenting and full of strange oaths, entered Johnson Miller. The dance director was always edgy on first nights, and during the foregoing conversation had been flitting about the stage like a white-haired moth. His deafness had kept him in complete ignorance that there was anything untoward afoot, and he now approached Mr. Goble with his watch in his hand. 8:25, he observed. "Time those girls were on stage." Mr. Goble, glad of a concrete target for his wrath, cursed him in about 250 rich and well-selected words. "Huh?" said Miller, hand to ear. Mr. Goble repeated the last 111 words, the pick of the bunch. "Can't hear," said Mr. Miller regretfully. "Got a cold." The grave danger that Mr. Goble, a thick-necked man, would undergo some sort of a stroke was averted by the presence of mind of the stage director, who, returning with the hat, presented it like a bouquet to his employer. Then, his hands being now unoccupied, formed them into a funnel through his flesh-and-blood megaphone, endeavored to impart the bad news. "The girls say they won't go on." Mr. Miller nodded. "I said it was time they were on." "They're on strike." "It's not," said Mr. Miller austerely, "what they like, it's what they're paid for. They ought to be on stage. We should be ringing up in 2 minutes." The stage director drew another breath, then thought the better of it. He had a wife and children, and if Dada went under with apoplexy, what became of the home, civilization's most sacred product? He relaxed the muscles of his diaphragm and reached for pencil and paper. Mr. Miller inspected the message, felt for his spectacle case, found it, opened it, took out his glasses, replaced the spectacle case, felt for his handkerchief, polished the glasses, replaced the handkerchief, put the glasses on and read. A blank look came into his face. "Why?" he inquired. The stage director, with a nod of the head intended to imply that he must be patient and all would come right in the future, recovered the paper and scribbled another sentence. Mr. Miller perused it. "Because May D'Arcy has got her notice?" he queried, amazed. "But the girl can't dance a step." The stage director, by means of a wave of the hand, a lifting of both eyebrows, and a wrinkling of the nose, replied that the situation, unreasonable as it might appear to the thinking man, was as he had stated and must be faced. What, he inquired, through the medium of a clever drooping of the mouth and a shrug of the shoulders, was to be done about it? Mr. Miller remained for a moment in meditation. "I'll go talk to them," he said. He flitted off, and the stage director leaned back against the asbestos curtain. He was exhausted and his throat was in agony, but nevertheless he was conscious of a feeling of quiet happiness. His life had been lived in the shadow of the constant fear that some day Mr. Goble might dismiss him. Should that disaster occur, he felt there was always a future for him in the movies. Scarcely had Mr. Miller disappeared on his peacemaking errand when there was a noise like a fowl going through a quickset hedge, and Mr. Saltzburg, brandishing his baton as if he were conducting an unseen orchestra, plunged through the scenery at the left upper entrance and charged excitedly down the stage. Having taken his musicians twice through the overture, he had for 10 minutes been sitting in silence, waiting for the curtain to go up. At last, his emotional nature cracking under the strain of this suspense, he had left his conductor's chair and plunged down under the stage by way of the musicians' bolt hole to ascertain what was causing the delay. "What is it? What is it? What is it?" inquired Mr. Saltzburg. "I wait and wait and wait and wait. We cannot play the overture again. What is it? What has happened?" Mr. Goble, that overwrought soul, had betaken himself to the wings, where he was striding up and down with his hands behind his back, chewing his cigar. The stage director braced himself once more to the task of explanation. "The girls have struck." Mr. Saltzburg blinked through his glasses. "The girls?" he repeated blankly. "Oh, damn it!" cried the stage director, his patience at last giving way. "You know what a girl is, don't you?" "They have what?" "Struck. Walked out on us. Refused to go on." Mr. Saltzburg reeled under the blow. "But it is impossible. Who is to sing the opening chorus?" In the presence of one to whom he could relieve his mind without fear of consequences, the stage director became savagely jocular. "That's all arranged," he said. "We're going to dress the carpenters in skirts. The audience won't notice anything wrong." "Should I speak to Mr. Goble?" queried Mr. Saltzburg doubtfully. "Yes, if you don't value your life," returned the stage director. Mr. Saltzburg pondered. "I will go and speak to the children," he said. "I will talk to them. They know me. I will make them be reasonable." He bustled off in the direction taken by Mr. Miller, his coat tails flying behind him. The stage director, with a tired sigh, turned to face Wally, who had come in through the iron pass door from the auditorium. "Hullo," said Wally cheerfully. "Going strong? How's everybody at home? Fine? So am I. By the way, am I wrong, or did I hear something about a theatrical entertainment of some sort here tonight?" He looked about him at the empty stage. In the wings on the prompt side could be discerned the flannel-clad forms of the gentlemanly members of the male ensemble, all dressed up for Mrs. Stuyvesant Van Dyke's tennis party. One or two of the principals were standing perplexedly in the lower entrance. The O.P. side had been given over by general consent to Mr. Goble for his perambulations. Every now and then he would flash into view through an opening in the scenery. "I understand that tonight was the night for the great revival of comic opera. Where are the comics, and why aren't they opping?" The stage director repeated his formula once more. "The girls have struck." "So have the clocks," said Wally. "It's past 9. The chorus refused to go on." "No, really. Just artistic loathing of the rotten piece, or is there some other reason?" They're sore because one of them has been given her notice, and they say they won't give a show unless she's taken back. They've struck. That Mariner girl started it." "She did!" Wally's interest became keener. "She would," he said approvingly. "She's a heroine. Little devil, I never liked that girl." "Now there," said Wally, "is just the point on which we differ. I have always liked her, and I've known her all my life. So, shipmate, if you have any derogatory remarks to make about Miss Mariner, keep them where they belong. There." He prodded the other sharply in the stomach. He was smiling pleasantly, but the stage director, catching his eye, decided that his advice was good and should be followed. It was just as bad for the home if the head of the family gets his neck broken as if he succumbs to apoplexy. "You surely aren't on their side," he said. "Me?" said Wally. "Of course I am. I'm always on the side of the downtrodden and oppressed. If you know of a dirtier trick than firing a girl just before the opening so that they won't have to pay her 2 weeks' salary, mention it. Till you do, I'll go on believing that it is the limit. Of course I'm on the girls' side. I'll make them a speech if they want me to, or head the procession with a banner if they are going to parade down the boardwalk. I'm for 'em. Father Abraham 100,000 strong. And then if you want my considered opinion, your old friend Goble has asked for it and got it. And I'm glad, if you don't mind my quoting Pollyanna for a moment. I hope it chokes him." "You'd better not let him hear you talking like that." "Au contraire, as we say in the gay city, I'm going to make a point of letting him hear me talk like that. Adjust the impression that I fear any Goble in shining armor, because I don't. I propose to speak my mind to him. I would beard him in his lair if he had a beard. Well, I'll clean shave him in his lair. That will be just as good. But hist, whom do we have here? Tell me, do you see the same thing I see?" Like the vanguard of a defeated army, Mr. Saltzburg was coming dejectedly across the stage. "Well?" said the stage director. "They would not listen to me," said Mr. Saltzburg brokenly. "The more I talked, the more they did not listen." He winced at a painful memory. "Miss Trevor stole my baton, and then they all lined up and sang the Star-Spangled Banner." "Not the words!" cried Wally incredulously. "Don't tell me they knew the words." "Mr. Miller is still up there arguing with them, but it will be of no use. What shall we do?" asked Mr. Saltzburg helplessly. "We ought to have rung up half an hour ago. What shall we do?" "We must go and talk to Goble," said Wally. "Something has got to be settled quick. When I left, the audience was getting so impatient that I thought he was going to walk out on us. He's one of those nasty, determined-looking men. So come along." Mr. Goble, intercepted as he was about to turn for another walk up stage, eyed the deputation sourly and put the same question that the stage director had put to Mr. Saltzburg. "Well?" Wally came briskly to the point. "You'll have to give in," he said, "or else go and make a speech to the audience, the burden of which will be that they can have their money back by applying to the box office. These Joans of Arc have got you by the short hairs." "I won't give in." "Then give out," said Wally, "or pay out if you prefer it. Trot along and tell the audience that the $4.50 in the house will be refunded." Mr. Goble gnawed his cigar. "I've been in the show business 15 years." "I know, and this sort of thing has never happened to you before. One gets new experiences." Mr. Goble cocked his cigar at a fierce angle and glared at Wally. Something told him that Wally's sympathies were not wholly with him. "They can't do this sort of thing to me," he growled. "Well, they are doing it to someone, aren't they?" said Wally. "And if it's not you, who is it?" "I've a damned good mind to fire them all." "A corking idea. I can't see a single thing wrong with it except that it would hang up the production for another 5 weeks and lose you your bookings and cost you a week's rent of this theater for nothing and mean having all the dresses made over and lead to all your principals going off and getting other jobs. These trifling things apart, we may call the suggestion a bright one." "You talk too damn much," said Mr. Goble, eyeing him with distaste. "Well, go on. You say something. Something sensible." "It is a very serious situation," began the stage director. "Oh, shut up," said Mr. Goble. The stage director subsided into his collar. "I cannot play the overture again," protested Mr. Saltzburg. "I cannot." At this point Mr. Miller appeared. He was glad to see Mr. Goble. He had been looking for him, for he had news to impart. "The girls," said Mr. Miller, "have struck. They won't go on." Mr. Goble, with the despairing gesture of one who realizes the impotence of words, dashed off for his favorite walk up stage. Wally took out his watch. 6 seconds and a bit, he said approvingly as the manager returned. "A very good performance. I should like to time you over the course in running kit." The interval for reflection, brief as it had been, had apparently enabled Mr. Goble to come to a decision. "Go," he said to the stage director, "and tell 'em that fool of a Darcy girl can play. We've got to get that curtain up." "Yes, Mr. Goble." The stage director galloped off. "Get back to your place," said the manager to Mr. Saltzburg, "and play the overture again." "Again." "Perhaps they didn't hear it the first 2 times," said Wally. Mr. Goble watched Mr. Saltzburg out of sight. Then he turned to Wally. "That damn Mariner girl was at the bottom of this. She started the whole thing. She told me so. Well, I'll settle her. She goes to morrow." "Wait a minute," said Wally. "Wait 1 minute. Bright as it is, that idea is out." "What the devil has it got to do with you?" "Only this, that if you fire Miss Mariner, I take that neat script which I've prepared and I tear it into 1,000 fragments. Or 900, anyway. I tear it. Miss Mariner opens in New York, or I pack up my work and leave." Mr. Goble's green eyes glowed. "Oh, you're stuck on her, are you?" he sneered. "I see." "Listen, dear heart," said Wally, gripping the manager's arm. "I can see that you are on the verge of introducing personalities into this very pleasant little chat. Resist the impulse. Why not let your spine stay where it is instead of having it kicked up through your hat? Keep to the main issue. Does Miss Mariner open in New York, or does she not?" There was a tense silence. Mr. Goble permitted himself a swift review of his position. He would have liked to do many things to Wally, beginning with ordering him out of the theatre, but prudence restrained him. He wanted Wally's work. He needed Wally in his business, and in the theatre, business takes precedence of personal feelings. "All right," he growled reluctantly. "That's a promise," said Wally. "I'll see that you keep it." He looked over his shoulder. The stage was filled with gaily coloured dresses. The mutineers had returned to duty. "Well, I'll be getting along. I'm rather sorry we agreed to keep clear of personalities, because I should have liked to say that if ever they have a skunk show at Madison Square Garden, you ought to enter and win the blue ribbon. Still, of course, under our agreement, my lips are sealed, and I can't even hint at it. Good-bye. See you later, I suppose." Mr. Goble, giving a creditable imitation of a living statue, was plucked from his thoughts by a hand upon his arm. It was Mr. Miller, whose unfortunate ailment had prevented him from keeping abreast of the conversation. "What did he say?" inquired Mr. Miller, interested. "I didn't hear what he said." Mr. Goble made no effort to inform him. End of Chapter 16. Read by Don W. Jenkins. Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com. Chapter 17 of Jill the Reckless by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. The Cost of a Row. 1. Otis Pilkington had left Atlantic City 2 hours after the conference which had followed the dress rehearsal, firmly resolved never to go near the Rose of America again. He had been wounded in his finest feelings. There had been a moment, when Mr. Goble had given him the choice between having the piece rewritten and cancelling the production altogether, when he had inclined to the heroic course. But for one thing, Mr. Pilkington would have defied the manager, refused to allow his script to be touched, and removed the play from his hands. That one thing was the fact that, up to the day of the dress rehearsal, the expenses of the production had amounted to the appalling sum of $32,859.68, all of which had come out of Mr. Pilkington's pocket. The figures, presented to him in a neatly typewritten column stretching over 2 long sheets of paper, had stunned him. He had no notion that musical plays cost so much. The costumes alone had come to $10,663.50, and somehow that odd 50 cents annoyed Otis Pilkington as much as anything on the list. A dark suspicion that Mr. Goble, who had seen to all the executive end of the business, had a secret arrangement with the costumer whereby he received a private rebate, deepened his gloom. Why, for $10,663.50 you could dress the whole female population of New York State and have a bit left over for Connecticut. So thought Mr. Pilkington as he read the bad news in the train. He only ceased to brood upon the high cost of costuming when, in the next line but one, there smote his eye an item of $498 for clothing. Clothing? Weren't costumes clothing? Why should he have to pay twice over for the same thing? Mr. Pilkington was raging over this, when something lower down in the column caught his eye. It was the words, "Clothing, $187.45. At this, Otis Pilkington uttered a stifled cry, so sharp and so anguished that an old lady in the next seat who was drinking a glass of milk dropped it and had to refund the railway company 35 cents for breakages. For the remainder of the journey she sat with one eye warily on Mr. Pilkington, waiting for his next move. This adventure quieted Otis Pilkington down, if it did not soothe him. He returned blushingly to a perusal of his bill of costs, nearly every line of which contained some item that infuriated and dismayed him. Shoes, $213.50. He could understand, but what on earth was Academy Rel? $105.50. What was cuts? $15. And what in the name of everything infernal was this item for frames, in which mysterious luxury he had apparently indulged to the extent of $94.50. Props occurred on the list no fewer than 17 times. Whatever his future, at whatever poorhouse he might spend his declining years, he was supplied with enough props to last his lifetime. Otis Pilkington stared blankly at the scenery that flitted past the train windows. Scenery! There had been 2 charges for scenery. Freedman, Samuel, scenery, $3,711, and Unit and Wicks, scenery, $2,120. He was suffering the torments of the ruined gamester at the roulette table. $32,859.68, and he was out of pocket $10,000 in addition from the check he had handed over 2 days ago to Uncle Chris as his share of the investment of starting Jill in the motion pictures. It was terrible. It deprived one of the power of thought. The power of thought, however, returned to Mr. Pilkington almost immediately, for, remembering suddenly that Roland Trevis had assured him that no musical production, except one of those elaborate girl shows with a chorus of 90, could possibly cost more than $15,000 at an outside figure, he began to think about Roland Trevis, and continued to think about him until the train pulled into Pennsylvania Station. For a week or more, the stricken financier confined himself mostly to his rooms, where he sat smoking cigarettes, gazing at Japanese prints, and trying not to think about props and rel. Then, gradually, the almost maternal yearning to see his brainchild once more, which can never be wholly crushed out of a young dramatist, returned to him, faintly at first, then getting stronger by degrees till it could no longer be resisted. Otis Pilkington, having instructed his Japanese valet to pack a few simple necessaries in a suitcase, took a cab to the Grand Central Station and caught an afternoon train for Rochester, where his recollection of the route planned for the tour told him the Rose of America would now be playing. Looking into his club on the way to cash a check, the first person he encountered was Freddie Rooke. "Good gracious," said Otis Pilkington, "what are you doing here?" Freddie looked up dully from his reading. The abrupt stoppage of his professional career, his life work, one might almost say, had left Freddie at a very loose end. And so hollow did the world seem to him at the moment, so uniformly futile all its so-called allurements, that to pass the time he had just been trying to read the National Geographic magazine. "Hullo," he said. "Well, might as well be here as anywhere, what?" he replied to the other's question. "But why aren't you playing?" "They sacked me. They've changed my part to a bally Scotchman. Well, I mean to say, I couldn't play a bally Scotchman." Mr. Pilkington groaned in spirit. Of all the characters in his musical fantasy on which he prided himself, that of Lord Finchley was his pet, and he had been burked, murdered, blotted out, in order to make room for a bally Scotchman. "The character's called the McWhustle of McWhustle now," said Freddie somberly. The McWhustle of McWhustle! Mr. Pilkington almost abandoned his trip to Rochester on receiving this devastating piece of information. "He comes on in Act One in kilts." "In kilts? At Mrs. Stuyvesant Van Dyke's garden party on Long Island?" "It isn't Mrs. Stuyvesant Van Dyke any longer, either," said Freddie. "She's been changed to the wife of a pickle manufacturer." "A pickle manufacturer?" "Yes, they said it ought to be a comedy part." If agony had not caused Mr. Pilkington to clutch for support at the back of a chair, he would undoubtedly have wrung his hands. "But it was a comedy part," he wailed. "It was full of the subtlest, most delicate satire on society. They were delighted with it at Newport. Oh, this is too much. I shall make a strong protest. I shall insist on these parts being kept as I wrote them. I must be going at once, or I shall miss my train." He paused at the door. "How was business in Baltimore?" "Rotten," said Freddie, and returned to his National Geographic magazine. Otis Pilkington tottered into his cab. He was shattered by what he had heard. They had massacred his beautiful play, and, doing so, had not even made a success of it by their own sordid commercial lights. Business at Baltimore had been rotten. That meant more expense, further columns of figures with frames and rel in front of them. He staggered into the station. "Hey!" cried the taxi driver. Otis Pilkington turned. 65 cents, mister, if you please. Forgetting I'm not your private chauffeur, wasn't you?" Mr. Pilkington gave him $1. Money, money. Life was just one long round of paying out and paying out. 2. The day which Mr. Pilkington had selected for his visit to the provinces was a Tuesday. The Rose of America had opened at Rochester on the previous night, after a week at Atlantic City in its original form, and a week at Baltimore in what might be called its second incarnation. Business had been bad in Atlantic City and no better in Baltimore, and a meager first-night house at Rochester had given the piece a cold reception, which had put the finishing touches to the depression of the company in spite of the fact that the Rochester critics, like those of Baltimore, had written kindly of the play. One of the maxims of the theatre is that out-of-town notices don't count, and the company had refused to be cheered by them. It is to be doubted, however, if even crowded houses would have aroused much response from the principals and chorus of The Rose of America. For 2 weeks without a break they had been working under forced draft, and they were weary in body and spirit. The new principals had had to learn parts in exactly half the time usually given for that purpose, and the chorus, after spending 5 weeks assimilating one set of steps and groupings, had been compelled to forget them and rehearse an entirely new set. From the morning after the first performance at Atlantic City, they had not left the theatre except for sketchy half-hour meals. Jill, standing listlessly in the wings while the scene-shifters arranged the second-act set, was aware of Wally approaching from the direction of the pass door. "Miss Mariner, I believe," said Wally. "I suppose you know you look perfectly wonderful in that dress. All Rochester's talking about it, and there is some idea of running excursion trains from Troy and Utica. A great stir it has made." Jill smiled. Wally was like a tonic to her during these days of overwork. He seemed to be entirely unaffected by the general depression, a fact which he attributed himself to the happy accident of being in a position to sit back and watch the others toil. But in reality Jill knew that he was working as hard as anyone. He was working all the time, changing scenes, adding lines, tinkering with lyrics, smoothing over principals whose nerves had become strained by the incessant rehearsing, keeping within bounds Mr. Goble's passion for being the big noise about the theatre. His cheerfulness was due to the spirit that was in him, and Jill appreciated it. She had come to feel very close to Wally since the driving rush of making over the Rose of America had begun. "They seemed quite calm tonight," she said. "I believe half of them were asleep." "They're always like that in Rochester. They cloak their deeper feelings. They wear the mask. But you can tell from the glassy look in their eyes that they are really seething inwardly. But what I came round about was, to give you this letter." Jill took the letter and glanced at the writing. It was from Uncle Chris. She placed it on the axe over the fire buckets for perusal later. "The man at the box office gave it to me," said Wally, "when I looked in there to find out how much money there was in the house tonight. The sum was so small that he had to whisper it." "I'm afraid the piece isn't a success." "Nonsense. Of course it is. We're doing fine. That brings me to section B of my discourse. I met poor old Pilkington in the lobby, and he said exactly what you have just said, only at greater length." "Is Mr. Pilkington here?" "He appears to have run down on the afternoon train to look at the show. He is catching the next train back to New York. Whenever I meet him, he always seems to be dashing off to catch the next train back to New York. Poor chap. Have you ever done a murder? If you haven't, don't. I know exactly what it feels like, and it feels rotten. After 2 minutes' conversation with Pilkington, I could sympathize with Macbeth when he chatted with Banquo. He said I had killed his play. He nearly wept, and he drew such a moving picture of poor helpless musical fantasy being lured into a dark alley by thugs and there slaughtered that he almost had me in tears too. I felt like a beetle-browed brute with a dripping knife and hands imbrued with innocent gore.
Poor Mr. Pilkington.
Once more you say exactly what he said, only more crisply. I comforted him as well as I could, told him all was for the best, and so on, and he flung the box office receipts in my face and said that the piece was as bad a failure commercially as it was artistically. I couldn't say anything to that, seeing what a house we've got tonight, except to bid him look out to the horizon where the sun will shortly shine. In other words, I told him that business was about to buck up and that later on he would be going about the place with a sprained wrist from clipping coupons. But he refused to be cheered, cursed me some more for ruining his piece, and ended by begging me to buy his share of it cheap.
You aren't going to?
No, I am not, but simply and solely for the reason that after that fiasco in London I raised my right hand, thus, and swore an oath that never as long as I lived would I again put up a cent for a production, were it the most obvious cinch on earth. I'm gun-shy. But if he does happen to get hold of anyone with a sporting disposition and a few thousands to invest, that person will make a fortune. This piece is going to be a gold mine." Jill looked at him in surprise. With anybody else but Wally, she would have attributed this confidence to author's vanity. But with Wally, she felt, the fact that the piece, as played now, was almost entirely his own work did not count. He viewed it dispassionately, and she could not understand why, in the face of half-empty houses, he should have such faith in it.
"But what makes you think so? We've been doing awfully badly so far."
Wally nodded. "And we shall do awfully badly in Syracuse the last half of this week. And why? For one thing, because the show isn't a show at all at present. Why should the people flock to pay for seats for what are practically dress rehearsals of an unknown play? Half the principals have had to get up their parts in 2 weeks, and they haven't had time to get anything out of them. They are groping for their lines all the time. The girls can't let themselves go in the numbers because they are wondering if they are going to remember the steps. The show hasn't had time to click together yet. It's just ragged. Take a look at it in another 2 weeks. I know. I don't say musical comedy is a very lofty form of art, but still there's a certain amount of science about it. If you go in for it long enough, you learn the tricks. And take it from me that if you have a good cast and some catchy numbers, it's almost impossible not to have a success. We've got an excellent cast now, and the numbers are fine. I tell you, as I tried to tell Pilkington, only he wouldn't listen, that this show is all right. There's a fortune in it for somebody, but I suppose Pilkington is now sitting in the smoking car of an eastbound train, trying to get the porter to accept his share in the piece instead of a tip." If Otis Pilkington was not actually doing that, he was doing something like it. Sunk in gloom, he bumped up and down on an uncomfortable seat, wondering why he had ever taken the trouble to make the trip to Rochester. He had found exactly what he had expected to find, a mangled caricature of his brainchild playing to a house half empty and wholly indifferent. The only redeeming feature, he thought vindictively, as he remembered what Roland Trevis had said about the cost of musical productions, was the fact that the new numbers were undoubtedly better than those which his collaborator had originally supplied. And the Rose of America, after a disheartening Wednesday matinee and a not much better reception on the Wednesday night, packed its baggage and moved to Syracuse, where it failed just as badly. Then for another 2 weeks it wandered on from one small town to another, up and down New York State and through the doldrums of Connecticut, tacking to and fro like a storm-battered ship, till finally the astute and discerning citizens of Hartford welcomed it with such a reception that hardened principals stared at each other in a wild surmise, wondering if these things could really be, and a weary chorus forgot its weariness and gave encore after encore with a snap and vim which even Mr. Johnson Miller was obliged to own approximated to something like it. Nothing to touch the work of his choruses of the old days, of course, but nevertheless fair, quite fair. The spirits of the company revived. Optimism reigned. Principals smiled happily and said they had believed in the thing all along. The ladies and gentlemen of the ensemble chattered contentedly of a year's run in New York. And the citizens of Hartford fought for seats, and if they could not get seats, stood up at the back. Of these things Otis Pilkington was not aware. He had sold his interest in the piece 2 weeks ago for $10,000 to a lawyer acting for some client unknown, and was glad to feel that he had saved something out of the wreck. End of Chapter 17. Read by Don W. Jenkins. Rancho San Diego, California, shaggybark.blogspot.com. Chapter 18 of Jill the Reckless by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Jill receives notice. 1. The violin soared to one last high note. The bassoon uttered a final moan. The pensive person at the end of the orchestra pit just under Mrs. Waddesleigh Peagrim's box, whose duty it was to slam the drum at stated intervals, gave that much enduring instrument a concluding wallop, and, laying aside his weapons, allowed his thoughts to stray in the direction of cooling drinks. Mr. Saltzburg lowered the baton which he had stretched quivering towards the roof and sat down and mopped his forehead. The curtain fell on the first act of The Rose of America, and simultaneously tremendous applause broke out from all over the Gotham Theater, which was crammed from floor to roof with that heterogeneous collection of humanity which makes up the audience of a New York opening performance. The applause continued like the breaking of waves on a stony beach. The curtain rose and fell, rose and fell, rose and fell again. An usher, stealing down the central aisle, gave to Mr. Saltzburg an enormous bouquet of American Beauty roses, which he handed to the prima donna, who took it with a brilliant smile and a bow, nicely combining humility with joyful surprise. The applause, which had begun to slacken, gathered strength again. It was a superb bouquet, nearly as big as Mr. Saltzburg himself. It had cost the prima donna close to $100 that morning at Thorley's, but it was worth every cent of the money. The house lights went up. The audience began to move up the aisles to stretch its legs and discuss the piece during the intermission. There was a general babble of conversation. Here, a composer who had not got an interpolated number in the show was explaining to another composer who had not got an interpolated number in the show the exact source from which a third composer who had got an interpolated number in the show had stolen the number which he had got interpolated. There, two musical comedy artists who were temporarily resting were agreeing that the prima donna was a dear thing, but that, contrary as it was to their lifelong policy to knock anybody, they must say that she was beginning to show the passage of years a trifle, and ought to be warned by some friend that her career as an ingenue was a thing of the past. Dramatic critics, slinking in twos and threes into dark corners, were telling each other that The Rose of America was just another of those things, but it had apparently got over. The general public was of the opinion that it was a knockout. "Otie, darling," said Mrs. Waddesleigh Peagrim, leaning her ample shoulder on Uncle Chris's perfectly fitting sleeve and speaking across him to young Mr. Pilkington, "I do congratulate you, dear. It's perfectly delightful. I don't know when I have enjoyed a musical piece so much. Don't you think it's perfectly darling, Major Selby?" "Capital!" agreed that suave man of the world, who had been bored as near extinction as makes no matter. "Congratulate you, my boy." "You clever, clever thing," said Mrs. Peagrim, skittishly striking her nephew on the knee with her fan. "I am proud to be your aunt. Aren't you proud to know him, Mr. Rooke?" The fourth occupant of the box awoke with a start from the species of stupor into which he had been plunged by the spectacle of the McWhustle of McWhustle in action. There had been other dark moments in Freddie's life. Once, back in London, Parker had sent him out into the heart of the West End without his spats, and he had not discovered their absence till he was halfway up Bond Street. On another occasion, having taken in a stranger at squash for a quit a game, he had discovered too late that the latter was an ex-public school champion. He had felt gloomy when he had learned of the breaking off of the engagement between Jill Mariner and Derek Underhill, and sad when it had been brought to his notice that London was giving Derek the cold shoulder in consequence. But never in his whole career had he experienced such gloom and such sadness as had come to him that evening while watching this unspeakable person in kilts murder that part that should have been his. And the audience, confound them, had roared with laughter at every damn silly thing the fellow had said. "Eh?" he replied. Oh, yes, rather, absolutely." "We're all proud of you, Otie darling," proceeded Mrs. Peagrim.
The piece is a wonderful success. You will make a fortune out of it. And just think, Major Selby, I tried my best to argue the poor dear boy out of putting it on. I thought it was so rash to risk his money in a theatrical venture. But then," said Mrs. Peagrim in extenuation, "I had only seen the piece when it was done at my house in Newport, and of course it really was rather dreadful nonsense then. I might have known that you would change it a great deal before you put it on in New York. As I always say, plays are not written, they are rewritten. Why, you have improved this piece 100%, Otie. I wouldn't know it was the same play." She slapped him smartly once more with her fan, ignorant of the gashes she was inflicting. Poor Mr. Pilkington was suffering twin torments: the torture of remorse and the agonized jealousy of the unsuccessful artist. It would have been bad enough to sit and watch a large audience rocking in its seats at the slapstick comedy which Wally Mason had substituted for his delicate social satire, but, had this been all, at least he could have consoled himself with the sordid reflection that he, as owner of the piece, was going to make a lot of money out of it. Now, even this material balm was denied him. He had sold out, and he was feeling like the man who parts for a song with shares in an apparently goldless gold mine, only to read in the papers next morning that a new reef has been located. Into each life some rain must fall. Quite a shower was falling now into young Mr. Pilkington's. "Of course," went on Mrs. Peagrim, "when the play was done at my house it was acted by amateurs, and you know what amateurs are. The cast tonight is perfectly splendid. I do think that Scotchman is the most killing creature. Don't you think he is wonderful, Mr. Rooke? We may say what we will against the upper strata of society, but it cannot be denied that breeding tells. Only by falling back for support on the traditions of his class and the solid support of a gentle upbringing was the last of the Rookes able to crush down the words that leaped to his lips and to substitute for them a politely conventional agreement. If Mr. Pilkington was feeling like a too impulsive seller of gold mines, Freddie's emotions were akin to those of the Spartan boy with the fox under his vest. Nothing but Winchester and Magdalen could have produced the smile which, though twisted and confined entirely to his lips, flashed onto his face and off again at his hostess' question. "Oh, rather. Priceless." "Wasn't that part an Englishman before?" asked Mrs. Peagrim. "I thought so. Well, it was a stroke of genius changing it. This Scotchman is too funny for words, and such an artist." Freddie rose shakily. One can stand just so much. "Think," he mumbled, "I'll be pushing along and smoking a cigarette." He groped his way to the door. "I'll come with you, Freddie, my boy," said Uncle Chris, who felt an imperative need of 5 minutes' respite from Mrs. Peagrim. "Let's get out into the air for a moment. Uncommonly warm it is here." Freddie assented. Air was what he felt he wanted most. Left alone in the box with her nephew, Mrs. Peagrim continued for some moments in the same vein, innocently twisting the knife in the open wound. It struck her from time to time that darling Otie was perhaps a shade unresponsive, but she put this down to the nervous strain inseparable from a first night of a young author's first play. "Why," she concluded, "you will make thousands and thousands of dollars out of this piece. I am sure it is going to be another Merry Widow." "You can't tell from a first night audience," said Mr. Pilkington somberly, giving out a piece of theatrical wisdom he had picked up at rehearsals. "Oh, but you can. It's so easy to distinguish polite applause from the real thing. No doubt many of the people down there have friends in the company or other reasons for seeming to enjoy the play, but look how the circle and the gallery were enjoying it. You can't tell me that that was not genuine. They love it. How hard," she proceeded commiseratingly, "you must have worked, poor boy, during the tour on the road to improve the piece so much. I never liked to say so before, but even you must agree with me now that the original version of yours, which was done down at Newport, was the most terrible nonsense. And how hard the company must have worked, too, Otie," cried Mrs. Peagrim, aglow with the magic of a brilliant idea. "I will tell you what you must really do. You must give a supper and dance to the whole company on the stage to-morrow night after the performance." "What?" cried Otis Pilkington, startled out of his lethargy by this appalling suggestion. Was he, the man who, after planking down $32,859.68 for props and frames and rel, had sold out for a paltry $10,000, to be still further victimized? "They do deserve it, don't they, after working so hard?" "It's impossible," said Otis Pilkington vehemently. "Out of the question." "But, Otie, darling, I was talking to Mr. Mason when he came down to Newport to see the piece last summer, and he told me that the management nearly always gives a supper to the company, especially if they have had a lot of extra rehearsing to do." Well, let Goble give them a supper if he wants to. But you know that Mr. Goble, though he has his name on the program as the manager, has really nothing to do with it. You own the piece, don't you?" For a moment Mr. Pilkington felt an impulse to reveal all, but refrained. He knew his Aunt Olive too well. If she found out that he had parted at a heavy loss with his valuable property, her whole attitude towards him would change. Or rather, it would revert to her normal attitude, which was not unlike that of a severe nurse to a weak-minded child. Even in his agony there had been a certain faint consolation, due to the entirely unwonted note of respect in the voice with which she had addressed him since the fall of the curtain. He shrank from forfeiting this respect, unentitled though he was to it. "Yes," he said in his precise voice, "that, of course, is so." "Well, then," said Mrs. Peagrim. "But it seems so unnecessary. And think what it would cost." This was a false step. Some of the reverence left Mrs. Peagrim's voice, and she spoke a little coldly. A gay and gallant spender herself, she had often had occasion to rebuke a tendency to over-parsimony in her nephew. "We must not be mean, Odie," she said. Mr. Pilkington keenly resented her choice of pronouns. "We," indeed. Who was going to foot the bill? Both of them hand in hand, or he alone, the chump, the boob, the easy mark who got this sort of thing wished on him? "I don't think it would be possible to get the stage for a supper party," he pleaded, shifting his ground. "Goble wouldn't give it to us." "As if Mr. Goble would refuse you anything after you've written a wonderful success for this theater. And isn't he getting his share of the profits? Directly after the performance you must go round and ask him. Of course he will be delighted to give you the stage. I will be hostess," said Mrs. Peagrim radiantly. "And now let me see. Whom shall we invite?" Mr. Pilkington stared gloomily at the floor, too bowed down by his weight of cares to resent the "we" which had plainly come to stay. He was trying to estimate the size of the gash which this preposterous entertainment would cleave in the Pilkington bankroll. He doubted if it was possible to go through with it under $500, and if, as seemed only too probable, Mrs. Peagrim took the matter in hand and gave herself her head, it might get into 4 figures. "Major Selby, of course," said Mrs. Peagrim musingly, with a cooing note in her voice. Long since had that polished man of affairs made a deep impression upon her. "Of course Mr. Selby, for one, and Mr. Rooke, and then there are 1 or 2 of my friends who would be hurt if they were left out. How about Mr. Mason? Isn't he a friend of yours?" Mr. Pilkington snorted. He had endured much and was prepared to endure more, but he drew the line at squandering his money on the man who had sneaked up behind his brainchild with a hatchet and chopped its precious person into little bits. "He is not a friend of mine," he said stiffly, "and I do not wish him to be invited." Having attained her main objective, Mrs. Peagrim was prepared to yield minor points. "Very well, if you do not like him," she said. "But I thought he was quite an intimate of yours. It was you who asked me to invite him to Newport last summer." "Much," said Mr. Pilkington coldly, "has happened since last summer." "Oh, very well," said Mrs. Peagrim again. "Then we will not include Mr. Mason. Now, directly the curtain has fallen, Odie dear, pop right around and find Mr. Goble and tell him what you want." 2. It is not only twin souls in this world who yearn to meet each other. Between Otis Pilkington and Mr. Goble there was little in common. Yet at the moment when Otis set out to find Mr. Goble, the thing which Mr. Goble desired most in the world was an interview with Otis. Since the end of the first act, the manager had been in a state of mental upheaval. Reverting to the gold mine simile again, Mr. Goble was in the position of a man who has had a chance of purchasing such a mine, and now, learning too late of the discovery of the reef, is feeling the truth of the poet's dictum that "of all sad words of tongue or pen, the saddest are these, it might have been." The electric success of The Rose of America had stunned Mr. Goble, and realizing as he did that he might have bought Otis Pilkington's share dirt cheap at almost any point of the preliminary tour, he was having a bad half hour with himself. The only ray in the darkness which brooded on his indomitable soul was the thought that it might still be possible, by getting hold of Mr. Pilkington before the notices appeared, and shaking his head sadly and talking about the misleading hopes which young authors so often draw from an enthusiastic first-night reception, and impressing upon him that first-night receptions do not deceive your expert who has been 15 years in the show business, and mentioning gloomily that he had heard a
couple of the critics roasting the show to beat the band. By doing all these things, it might still be possible to depress Mr. Pilkington's young enthusiasm and induce him to sell his share at a sacrifice price to a great-hearted friend who didn't think the thing would run a week, but was willing to buy as a sporting speculation, because he thought Mr. Pilkington a good kid, and after all, these shows that flop in New York sometimes have a chance on the road. Such were the meditations of Mr. Goble, and on the final fall of the curtain, amid unrestrained enthusiasm on the part of the audience, he had dispatched messengers in all directions with instructions to find Mr. Pilkington and conduct him to the presence. Meanwhile, he waited impatiently on the empty stage. The sudden advent of Wally Mason, who appeared at this moment, upset Mr. Goble terribly. Wally was a factor in the situation which he had not considered. An infernal tactless fellow, always trying to make mischief and upset honest merchants. Wally, if present at the interview with Otis Pilkington, would probably try to act in restraint of trade, and would blurt out some untimely truth about the prospects of the piece. Not for the first time Mr. Goble wished Wally a sudden stroke of apoplexy. "Went well, eh?" said Wally amiably. He did not like Mr. Goble, but on the first night of a successful piece personal antipathies may be sunk. Such was his effervescent good humour at the moment that he was prepared to treat Mr. Goble as a man and a brother. Replied Mr. Goble doubtfully, paving the way. "What are you hmming about?" demanded Wally, astonished. "The thing's a riot." "You never know," responded Mr. Goble in the minor key. "Well," Wally stared, "I don't know what more you want. The audience sat up on its hind legs and squealed, didn't they?" "I have an idea," said Mr. Goble, raising his voice as the long form of Mr. Pilkington crossed the stage towards him, "that the critics will roast it. If you ask me," he went on loudly, "it's just the sort of show the critics will pan the life out of. I've been 15 years in the..." "Critics!" cried Wally. "Well, I've just been talking to Alexander of the Times, and he said it was the best musical piece he had ever seen, and that all the other men he had talked to thought the same." Mr. Goble turned a distorted face to Mr. Pilkington. He wished that Wally would go, but Wally, he reflected bitterly, was one of those men who never go. He faced Mr. Pilkington and did the best he could. "Of course it's got a chance," he said gloomily. "Any show has got a chance, but I don't know. Mr. Pilkington was not interested in the future prospects of the Rose of America. He had a favour to ask, and he wanted to ask it, have it refused if possible, and get away. It occurred to him that by substituting for the asking of a favour a peremptory demand, he might save himself $1,000. "I want the stage after the performance tomorrow night for a supper to the company," he said brusquely. He was shocked to find Mr. Goble immediately complacent. "Why, sure," said Mr. Goble readily. "Go as far as you like." He took Mr. Pilkington by the elbow and drew him up stage, lowering his voice to a confidential undertone. "And now listen," he said. "I've something I want to talk to you about. Between you and I and the lamp post, I don't think this show will last a month in New York. It don't add up right. There's something all wrong about it." Mr. Pilkington assented with an emphasis which amazed the manager. "I quite agree with you. If you had kept it the way it was originally..." "Too late for that," sighed Mr. Goble, realizing that his star was in the ascendant. He had forgotten for the moment that Mr. Pilkington was an author. "We must make the best of a bad job. Now, you're a good kid, and I wouldn't like you to go around town saying that I had let you in. It isn't business, maybe, but just because I don't want you to have any kick coming, I'm ready to buy your share of the thing and call it a deal. After all, it may get money on the road. It ain't likely, but there's a chance, and I'm willing to take it. Well, listen, I'm probably robbing myself, but I'll give you $15,000 if you want to sell." A hated voice spoke at his elbow. "I'll make you a better offer than that," said Wally. "Give me your share of the show for $3 in cash, and I'll throw in a pair of sock suspenders and an Ingersoll. Is it a go?" Mr. Goble regarded him balefully. "Who told you to butt in?" he inquired sourly. "Conscience," replied Wally. "Old Henry W. Conscience. I refuse to stand by and see the slaughter of the innocents. Why don't you wait till he's dead before you skin him?" He turned to Mr. Pilkington. "Don't you be a fool," he said earnestly. "Can't you see the thing is the biggest hit in years? Do you think Jesse James here would be offering you a cent for your share if he didn't know there was a fortune in it? Do you imagine..." "It is immaterial to me," interrupted Otis Pilkington loftily. "What Mr. Goble offers. I have already sold my interest." "What?" cried Mr. Goble. "When?" cried Wally. "I sold it halfway through the road tour," said Mr. Pilkington, "to a lawyer acting on behalf of a client whose name I did not learn." In the silence which followed this revelation, another voice spoke. "I should like to speak to you for a moment, Mr. Goble, if I may." It was Jill, who had joined the group unperceived. Mr. Goble glowered at Jill, who met his gaze composedly. "I'm busy," snapped Mr. Goble. "See me tomorrow."
"I would prefer to see you now."
"You would prefer!" Goble waved his hands despairingly, as if calling on heaven to witness the persecution of a good man. Jill exhibited a piece of paper stamped with the letter heading of the management.
"It's about this," she said. "I found it in the box as I was going out."
"What's that?"
"It seems to be a fortnight's notice."
"And that," said Mr. Goble, "is what it is." Wally uttered an exclamation. "Do you mean to say...?" "Yes, I do," said the manager, turning on him. He felt that he had outmaneuvered Wally. "I agreed to let her open in New York, and she's done it, hasn't she? Now she can get out. I don't want her. I wouldn't have her if you paid me. She's a nuisance in the company, always making trouble, and she can go."
"But I would prefer not to go," said Jill.
"You would prefer?" The phrase infuriated Mr. Goble. "And what has what you would prefer got to do with it?"
"Well, you see," said Jill, "I forgot to tell you before, but I own the piece."
3. Mr. Goble's jaw fell. He had been waving his hands in another spacious gesture, and he remained frozen with outstretched arms, like a semaphore. This evening had been a series of shocks for him, but this was the worst shock of all. "You what?" he stammered.
"I own the piece," repeated Jill. "Surely that gives me authority to say what I want done and what I don't want done."
There was a silence. Mr. Goble, who was having difficulty with his vocal cords, swallowed once or twice. Wally and Mr. Pilkington stared dumbly. At the back of the stage, a belated scene shifter, homeward bound, was whistling as much as he could remember of the refrain of a popular song. "What do you mean, you own the piece?" Mr. Goble at length gurgled.
"I bought it."
"You bought it?"
"I bought Mr. Pilkington's share through a lawyer for $10,000.
$10,000? Where did you get $10,000? Light broke upon Mr. Goble. The thing became clear to him. "Damn it!" he cried. "I might have known you had some man behind you. You'd never have been so darn fresh if you hadn't some John in the background paying the bills. Well, of all the...." He broke off abruptly, not because he had said all that he wished to say, for he had only touched the fringe of his subject, but because at this point Wally's elbow smote him in the parts above the third button of his waistcoat and jarred all the breath out of him. "Be quiet," said Wally dangerously. He turned to Jill. "Jill, you don't mind telling me how you got $10,000, do you?"
"Of course not, Wally. Uncle Chris sent it to me. Do you remember giving me a letter from him at Rochester? The check was in that."
Wally stared. "Your uncle? But he hasn't any money."
"He must have made it somehow."
"But he couldn't. How could he?" Otis Pilkington suddenly gave tongue. He broke in on them with a loud noise that was half a snort and half a yell. Stunned by the information that it was Jill who had bought his share in the piece, Mr. Pilkington's mind had recovered slowly and then had begun to work with a quite unusual rapidity. During the preceding conversation he had been doing some tense thinking, and now he saw all. "It's a swindle! It's a deliberate swindle!" shrilled Mr. Pilkington. The tortoise-shell-rimmed spectacles flashed sparks. "I've been made a fool of! I've been swindled! I've been robbed!" Jill regarded him with wide eyes.
"What do you mean?"
"You know what I mean."
"I certainly do not. You were perfectly willing to sell the piece."
"I'm not talking about that. You know what I mean. I've been robbed." Wally snatched at his arm as it gyrated past him in a gesture of anguish which rivaled the late efforts in that direction of Mr. Goble, who was now leaning against the safety curtain trying to get his breath back. "Don't be a fool," said Wally curtly. "Talk sense. You know perfectly well that Miss Mariner wouldn't swindle you." "She may not have been in it," conceded Mr. Pilkington. "I don't know whether she was or not. But that uncle of hers swindled me out of $10,000, the smooth old crook."
"Don't talk like that about Uncle Chris," said Jill, her eyes flashing. "Tell me what you mean."
"Yes, come on, Pilkington," said Wally grimly. "You've been scattering some pretty serious charges about. Let's hear what you base them on. Be coherent for a couple of seconds." Mr. Goble filled his depleted lungs. "If you ask me," he began. "We don't," said Wally curtly. "This has nothing to do with you. Well," he went on, "we're waiting to hear what this is all about." Mr. Pilkington gulped. Like most men of weak intellect who are preyed upon by the wolves of the world, he had ever a strong distaste for admitting that he had been deceived. He liked to regard himself as a shrewd young man who knew his way about and could take care of himself. "Major Selby," he said, adjusting his spectacles, which emotion had caused to slip down his nose, "came to me a few weeks ago with a proposition. He suggested the formation of a company to start Miss Mariner in the motion pictures." "What?" cried Jill. "In the motion pictures," repeated Mr. Pilkington. He wished to know if I cared to advance any capital towards the venture. I thought it over carefully and decided that I was favorably disposed towards the scheme. Mr. Pilkington gulped again. I gave him a check for $10,000. "Of all the fools!" said Mr. Goble, with a sharp laugh. He caught Wally's eye and subsided once more. Mr. Pilkington's fingers strayed agitatedly to his spectacles. "I may have been a fool," he cried shrilly, "though I was perfectly willing to risk the money had it been applied to the object for which I gave it. But when it comes to giving $10,000 just to have it paid back to me in exchange for a very valuable piece of theatrical property, my own money handed back to me..." Words failed Mr. Pilkington. "I've been deliberately swindled," he added, after a moment, harking back to the main motif. Jill's heart was like lead. She could not doubt for an instant the truth of what the victim had said. Woven into every inch of the fabric, plainly hallmarked on its surface, she could perceive the signature of Uncle Chris. If he had come and confessed to her himself, she could not have been more certain that he had acted precisely as Mr. Pilkington had charged. There was that same impishness, that same bland unscrupulousness, that same pathetic desire to do her a good turn however it might affect anybody else, which, if she might compare the two things, had caused him to pass her off on unfortunate Mr. Mariner of Brookport as a girl of wealth, with tastes in the direction of real estate. Wally was not so easily satisfied. "You've no proof whatever." Jill shook her head. "It's true, Wally. I know Uncle Chris. It must be true." "But, Jill..." "It must be true. How else could Uncle Chris have got the money?" Mr. Pilkington, much encouraged by this ready acquiescence in his theories, got under way once more. "The man's a swindler! A swindler! He robbed me! I have been robbed! He never had any intention of starting a motion picture company. He planned it all out." Jill cut into the babble of his denunciations. She was sick at heart, and she spoke almost listlessly. "Mr. Pilkington..." The victim stopped. "Mr. Pilkington, if what you say is true, and I'm afraid there is no doubt that it is, the only thing I can do is to give you back your property. So will you please try to understand that everything is just as it was before you gave my uncle the money. You've got back your $10,000, and you've got back your peace, so there's nothing more to talk about." Mr. Pilkington, dimly realizing that the financial aspect of the affair had been more or less satisfactorily adjusted, was nevertheless conscious of a feeling that he was being thwarted. He had much more to say about Uncle Chris and his methods of doing business, and it irked him to be cut short like this. "Yes, but I do not think... That's all very well, but I have by no means finished..." "Yes, you have," said Wally. "There's nothing more to talk about," repeated Jill. "I'm sorry this should have happened, but you've nothing to complain about now, have you? Good night." And she turned quickly away and walked towards the door. "But I hadn't finished," wailed Mr. Pilkington, clutching at Wally. He was feeling profoundly aggrieved. If it is bad to be all dressed up and no place to go, it is almost worse to be full of talk and have no one to talk it to. Otis Pilkington had at least another 20 minutes of speech inside him on the topic of Uncle Chris, and Wally was the nearest human being with a pair of ears. Wally was in no mood to play the part of confidant. He pushed Mr. Pilkington earnestly in the chest and raced after Jill. Mr. Pilkington, with the feeling that the world was against him, tottered back into the arms of Mr. Goble, who had now recovered his breath and was ready to talk business. "Have a good cigar," said Mr. Goble, producing one. "Now, see here, let's get right down to it. If you'd care to sell out for $20,000... "I would not care to sell out for $20,000, yelled the overwrought Mr. Pilkington. "I wouldn't sell out for $1 million. You're a swindler. You want to rob me. You're a crook." "Yes, yes," assented Mr. Goble gently. "But all joking aside, suppose I was to go up to $25,000. He twined his fingers lovingly in the slack of Mr. Pilkington's coat. "Come now, you're a good kid. Shall we say $25,000? "We will not say $25,000. Let me go." Now, pleaded Mr. Goble. "Be sensible. Don't get all worked up. Say, do have a good cigar." "I won't have a good cigar," shouted Mr. Pilkington. He detached himself with a jerk and stalked with long strides up the stage. Mr. Goble watched him go with a lowering gaze. A heavy sense of the unkindness of fate was oppressing Mr. Goble. If you couldn't gyp a bone-headed amateur out of a piece of property, whom could you gyp? Mr. Goble sighed. It hardly seemed to him worth while going on. 4. Out in the street, Wally had overtaken Jill, and they faced one another in the light of a street lamp. 41st Street at midnight is a quiet oasis. They had it to themselves. Jill was pale, and she was breathing quickly, but she forced a smile. "Well, Wally," she said, "my career as a manager didn't last long, did it?" "What are you going to do?" Jill looked down the street. "I don't know," she said. "I suppose I shall have to start trying to find something." But Jill drew him suddenly into the dark alleyway leading to the stage door of the Gotham Theatre's nearest neighbor, and as she did so, a long, thin form swathed in an overcoat and surmounted by an opera hat flashed past. "I don't think I could have gone through another meeting with Mr. Pilkington," said Jill. "It wasn't his fault, and he was quite justified, but what he said about Uncle Chris rather hurt." Wally, who had ideas of his own, similar to those of Mr. Pilkington, on the subject of Uncle Chris, and had intended to express them, prudently kept them unspoken. "I suppose," he said, "there is no doubt?" "There can't be. Poor Uncle Chris. He is like Freddie. He means well." There was a pause. They left the alley and walked down the street. "Where are you going now?" asked Wally. "I'm going home." "Where's home?" 49th Street. I live in a boarding house there." A sudden recollection of the boarding house at which she had lived in Atlantic City smote Wally, and it turned the scale. He had not intended to speak, but he could not help himself. "Jill," he cried, "it's no good. I must say it. I want to get you out of all this. I want to take care of you. Why should you go on living this sort of life when... Why don't you let me...." He stopped. Even as he spoke, he realized the futility of what he was saying. Jill was not a girl to be won with words. They walked on in silence for a moment. They crossed Broadway, noisy with night traffic, and passed into the stillness of the other side. "Wally?" said Jill at last. She was looking straight in front of her. Her voice was troubled. "Yes?" Jill hesitated. "Wally, you wouldn't want me to marry you if you knew you weren't the only man in the world that mattered to me, would you?" They had reached 6th Avenue before Wally replied. "No," he said. For an instant Jill could not have said whether the feeling that shot through her like the abrupt touching of a nerve was relief or disappointment. Then, suddenly, she realized that it was disappointment. It was absurd to her to feel disappointed, but at that moment she would have welcomed a different attitude in him. If only this problem of hers could be taken forcefully out of her hands, what a relief it would be. If only Wally, masterfully insistent, would batter down her hesitations and grab her, knock her on the head and carry her off like a caveman, care less about her happiness and concentrate on his own, what a solution it would be. But then he wouldn't be Wally. Nevertheless, Jill gave a little sigh. Her new life had changed her already. It had blunted the sharp edge of her independence. Tonight she was feeling the need of someone to lean on, someone strong and cozy and sympathetic who would treat her like a little girl and shield her from all the roughness of life. The fighting spirit had gone out of her, and she was no longer the little warrior facing the world with a brave eye and a tilted chin. She wanted to cry and be petted. "No," said Wally again. There had been the faintest suggestion of a doubt when he had spoken the word before, but now it shot out like a bullet. "And I'll tell you why. I want you. And if you married me feeling like that, it wouldn't be you. I want Jill, the whole Jill, and nothing but Jill, and if I can't have that, I'd rather not have anything. Marriage isn't a motion picture close-up with slow fade-out on the embrace. It's a partnership. And what's the good of a partnership if your heart's not in it? It's like collaborating with a man you dislike. I believe you wish sometimes, not often, perhaps, but when you're feeling lonely and miserable, that I would pester and bludgeon you into marrying me. What's the matter?" Jill had started. It was disquieting to have her thoughts read with such accuracy. "Nothing," she said. "It wouldn't be any good," Wally went on, "because it wouldn't be me. I couldn't keep that attitude up, and I know I should hate myself for ever having tried it. There's nothing in the world I wouldn't do to help you, though I know it's no use offering to do anything. You're a fighter, and you mean to fight your own battle. It might happen that, if I kept after you and badgered you and nagged you, one of these days, when you were feeling particularly all alone in the world and tired of fighting for yourself, you might consent to marry me. But it wouldn't do. Even if you reconciled yourself to it, it wouldn't do. I suppose the cave woman sometimes felt rather relieved when everything was settled for her with a club, but I'm sure the cave man must have had a hard time ridding himself of the thought that he had behaved like a cad and taken a mean advantage. I don't want to feel like that. I couldn't make you happy if I felt like that. Much better to have you go on regarding me as a friend, knowing that if ever your feelings do change, that I am right there, waiting." "But by that time, your feelings will have changed." Wally laughed. "Never." "You'll meet some other girl." "I've met every girl in the world. None of them will do." The lightness came back into Wally's voice. "I'm sorry for the poor things, but they won't do. Take 'em away. There's only one girl in the world for me. Oh, confound it, why is it that one always thinks in song titles? Well, there it is. I'm not going to bother you. We're pals, and as a pal, may I offer you my bankroll?" "No," said Jill. She smiled up at him. "I believe you would give me your coat if I asked you for it." Wally stopped. "Do you want it? Here you are." "Wally, behave. There's a policeman looking at you." "Oh, well, if you won't, it's a good coat all the same." They turned the corner and stopped before a brownstone house, with a long ladder of untidy steps running up to the front door. "Is this where you live?" Wally asked. He looked at the gloomy place disapprovingly. "You do choose the most awful places." "I don't choose them. They're thrust on me. Yes, this is where I live. If you want to know the exact room, it's the third window up there over the front door. Well, good night." "Good night," said Wally. He paused. "Jill?" "Yes?" "I know it's not worth mentioning, and it's breaking out agreement to mention it, but you do understand, don't you?" "Yes, Wally dear, I understand." "I'm around the corner, you know, waiting, and if you ever do change, all you've got to do is just come to me and say, 'It's all right.'" Jill laughed a little shakily. "That doesn't sound very romantic." "Not sound romantic? If you can think of any three words in the language that sound more romantic, let me have them. Well, never mind how they sound, just say them and watch the result. But you must get to bed. Good night." "Good night, Wally." She passed in through the dingy door. It closed behind her, and Wally stood for some moments staring at it with a gloomy repulsion. He thought he had never seen a dingier door. Then he started to walk back to his apartment. He walked very quickly, with clenched hands. He was wondering if, after all, there was not something to be said for the methods of the caveman when he went a-wooing. Twinges of conscience the caveman may have had when all was over, but at least he had established his right to look after the woman he loved. End of Chapter 18. Read by Don W. Jenkins. Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com. Chapter 19 of Jill the Reckless. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Mrs. Peagrim burns incense. "They tell me, I am told, I am informed, no, one moment, Miss Frisby." Mrs. Peagrim wrinkled her fair forehead. It has been truly said that there is no agony like the agony of literary composition, and Mrs. Peagrim was having a rather bad time getting the requisite snap and ginger into her latest communication to the press. She bit her lip, and would have passed her twitching fingers restlessly through her hair but for the thought of the damage which such an action must do to her coiffure. Miss Frisby, her secretary, an anemic and negative young woman, waited patiently, pad on knee, and tapped her teeth with her pencil. "Please do not make that tapping noise, Miss Frisby," said the sufferer querulously. "I cannot think. Odie dear, can't you suggest a good phrase? You ought to be able to, being an author." Mr. Pilkington, who was strewn over an armchair by the window, awoke from his meditations, which, to judge from the furrow just above the bridge of his tortoise-shell spectacles and the droop of his weak chin, were not pleasant. It was the morning after the production of The Rose of America, and he had passed a sleepless night thinking of the harsh words he had said to Jill. Could she ever forgive him? Would she have the generosity to realize that a man ought not to be held accountable for what he says in the moment when he discovers that he has been cheated, deceived, robbed, in a word, hornswoggled? He had been brooding on this all night, and he wanted to go on brooding now. His aunt's question interrupted his train of thought. "Eh?" he said vaguely, gaping. "Oh, don't be so absent-minded," snapped Mrs. Peagrim, not unjustifiably annoyed. "I am trying to compose a paragraph for the papers about our party to-night, and I can't get the right phrase. Read what you've written, Miss Frisby." Miss Frisby, having turned a pale eye on the pothooks and twiddlies in her notebook, translated them in a pale voice. "Surely of all the leading hostesses in New York society there can be few more versatile than Mrs. Waddesleigh Peagrim. I am amazed every time I go to her delightful home on West End Avenue to see the scope and variety of her circle of intimates. Here you will see an ambassador with a fever." "With a what?" demanded Mrs. Peagrim sharply. "Fever, I thought you said," replied Miss Frisby stolidly. "I wrote fever." "Diva! Do use your intelligence, my good girl. Go on."
Here you will see an ambassador with a diva from the opera exchanging the latest gossip from the chancelleries for intimate news of the world behind the scenes. There, the author of the latest novel talking literature to the newest debutante. Truly one may say that Mrs. Peagrim has revived the saloon." Mrs. Peagrim bit her lip. "Salon." "Salon," said Miss Frisbee unemotionally. "They tell me, I am told, I am informed." She paused. "That's all I have." "Scratch out those last words," said Mrs. Peagrim irritably. "You really are hopeless, Miss Frisbee. Couldn't you see that I had stopped dictating and was searching for a phrase? Odie, what is a good phrase for 'I am told'?" Mr. Pilkington forced his wandering attention to grapple with the problem. "I hear," he suggested at length. "Chaw!" ejaculated his aunt. Then her face brightened. "I have it. Take dictation, please, Miss Frisbee. A little bird whispers to me that there were great doings last night on the stage of the Gotham Theatre after the curtain had fallen on The Rose of America, which, as everybody knows, is the work of Mrs. Peagrim's clever young nephew, Otis Pilkington." Mrs. Peagrim shot a glance at her clever young nephew to see how he appreciated the boost, but Otis' thoughts were far away once more. He was lying on his spine, brooding. Mrs. Peagrim resumed her dictation. "In honor of the extraordinary success of the piece, Mrs. Peagrim, who certainly does nothing by halves, entertained the entire company to a supper dance after the performance. A number of prominent people were among the guests, and Mrs. Peagrim was a radiant and vivacious hostess. She has never looked more charming. The high jinks were kept up to an advanced hour, and everyone agreed that they had never spent a more delightful evening. There. Type as many copies as are necessary, Miss Frisbee, and send them out this afternoon with photographs." Miss Frisbee having vanished in her pallid way, the radiant and vivacious hostess turned on her nephew again. "I must say, Odie," she began complainingly, "that for a man who has had a success like yours, you are not very cheerful. I should have thought the notices of the piece would have made you the happiest man in New York." There was once a melodrama where the child of the persecuted heroine used to dissolve the gallery in tears by saying, "Happiness! What is happiness, mother?" Mr. Pilkington did not use these actual words, but he reproduced the stricken infant's tone with great fidelity. "Notices? What are notices to me?" "Oh, don't be so affected," cried Mrs. Peagrim. "Don't pretend that you don't know every word of them by heart." "I have not seen the notices, Aunt Olive," said Mr. Pilkington dully. Mrs. Pilkington looked at him with positive alarm. She had never been overwhelmingly attached to her long nephew, but since his rise to fame something resembling affection had sprung up in her, and his attitude now disturbed her. "You can't be well, Odie," she said solicitously. "Are you ill?" "I have a severe headache," replied the martyr. "I passed a wakeful night." "Let me go and mix you a dose of the most wonderful mixture," said Mrs. Peagrim maternally. "Poor boy, I don't wonder, after all the nervousness and excitement. You sit quite still and rest. I will be back in a moment." She bustled out of the room, and Mr. Pilkington sagged back into his chair. He had hardly got his meditations going once more when the door opened and the maid announced, "Major Selby." "Good morning," said Uncle Chris breezily, sailing down the fairway with outstretched hand. "How are... oh." He stopped abruptly, perceiving that Mrs. Peagrim was not present, and a more disturbing discovery that Otis Pilkington was. It would be exaggeration to say that Uncle Chris was embarrassed. That master mind was never actually embarrassed, but his jauntiness certainly ebbed a little, and he had to pull his moustache twice before he could face the situation with his customary aplomb. He had not expected to find Otis Pilkington here, and Otis was the last man he wished to meet. He had just parted from Jill, who had been rather plain-spoken with regard to the recent financial operations, and though possessed only of a rudimentary conscience, Uncle Chris was aware that his next interview with young Mr. Pilkington might have certain aspects bordering on awkwardness, and he would have liked time to prepare a statement for the defence. However, here the man was, and the situation must be faced. "Pilkington!" he cried. "My dear fellow! Just the man I wanted to see. I'm afraid there has been a little misunderstanding. Of course, it has all been cleared up now, but still I must insist on making a personal explanation. Really, I must insist. The whole matter was a most absurd misunderstanding. It was like this." Here Uncle Chris paused in order to devote a couple of seconds to thought. He had said it was "like this," and he gave his moustache another pull as though he were trying to drag inspiration out of it.
His blue eyes were as frank and honest as ever, and showed no trace of the perplexity in his mind. But he had to admit to himself that if he managed to satisfy his hearer that all was for the best, and that he had acted uprightly and without blame, he would be doing well. Fortunately, the commercial side of Mr. Pilkington was entirely dormant this morning. The matter of the $10,000 seemed trivial to him in comparison with the weightier problems which occupied his mind.
"Have you seen Miss Mariner?" he asked eagerly.
"Yes, I have just parted from her. She was upset, poor girl, of course, exceedingly upset."
Mr. Pilkington moaned hollowly. "Is she very angry with me?"
For a moment, the utter inexplicability of the remark silenced Uncle Chris. Why Jill should be angry with Mr. Pilkington for being robbed of $10,000 he could not understand, for Jill had told him nothing of the scene that had taken place on the previous night. But evidently this point was to Mr. Pilkington the nub of the matter, and Uncle Chris, like the strategist he was, rearranged his forces to meet the new development. "Angry?" he said slowly. "Well, of course." He did not know what it was all about, but no doubt if he confined himself to broken sentences which meant nothing, light would shortly be vouchsafed to him.
"In the heat of the moment," confessed Mr. Pilkington, "I'm afraid I said things to Miss Mariner which I now regret."
Uncle Chris began to feel on solid ground again. "Dear, dear," he murmured regretfully.
"I spoke hastily."
"Always think before you speak, my boy."
"I considered that I had been cheated."
"My dear boy!" Uncle Chris's blue eyes opened wide. "Please, haven't I said that I could explain all that? It was a pure misunderstanding."
"Oh, I don't care about that part of it."
"Quite right," said Uncle Chris cordially. "Let bygones be bygones. Start with a clean slate. You have your money back, and there's no need to say another word about it. Let us forget it," he concluded generously. "And if I have any influence with Jill, you may count on me to use it to dissipate any little unfortunate rift which may have occurred between you."
"You think there's a chance that she might overlook what I said?"
"As I say, I will use any influence I may possess to heal the breach. I like you, my boy, and I am sure that Jill likes you. She will make allowances for any ill-judged remarks you may have uttered in a moment of heat." Mr. Pilkington brightened, and Mrs. Peagrim, returning with a medicine glass, was pleased to see him looking so much better.
"You're a positive wizard, Major Selby," she said archly. "What have you been saying to the poor boy to cheer him up so? He has a bad headache this morning."
"Headache?" said Uncle Chris, starting like a war horse that has heard the bugle. "I don't know if I ever mentioned it, but I used to suffer from headaches at one time. Extraordinarily severe headaches. I tried everything until one day a man I knew recommended a thing called... Don't know if you ever heard of it." Mrs. Peagrim, in her role of ministering angel, was engrossed with her errand of mercy. She was holding the medicine glass to Mr. Pilkington's lips, and the seed fell on stony ground.
"Drink this, dear," urged Mrs. Peagrim.
"Nervino," said Uncle Chris.
"There," said Mrs. Peagrim. "That will make you feel much better. How well you always look, Major Selby."
"And yet at one time," said Uncle Chris perseveringly, "I was a martyr."
"I can't remember if I told you last night about the party. We are giving a little supper dance to the company of Odie's play after the performance this evening. Of course you will come."
Uncle Chris philosophically accepted his failure to secure the ear of his audience. Other opportunities would occur. "Delighted," he said. "Delighted."
"Quite a simple, bohemian little affair," proceeded Mrs. Peagrim. "I thought it was only right to give the poor things a little treat after they have all worked so hard."
"Certainly, certainly. A capital idea."
"We shall be quite a small party. If I once started asking anybody outside our real friends, I should have to ask everybody."
The door opened.
"Mr. Rooke," announced the maid.
Freddie, like Mr. Pilkington, was prey to gloom this morning. He had read one or two of the papers, and they had been disgustingly lavish in their praise of the McWhustle of McWhustle. It made Freddie despair of the New York press. In addition to this, he had been woken up at 7 o'clock, after going to sleep at 3, by the ringing of the telephone and the announcement that a gentleman wished to see him, and he was weighed down with that heavy-eyed languor which comes to those whose night's rest is broken.
"Why, how do you do, Mr. Rooke?" said Mrs. Peagrim.
"Howdy-do," replied Freddie, blinking in the strong light from the window. "Hope I'm not barging in and all that sort of thing. I came around about this party tonight, you know."
"Oh, yes?"
"Was wondering," said Freddie, "if you would mind if I brought a friend of mine along.
popped in on me from England this morning, at 7 o'clock," said Freddie plaintively. "Ghastly hour, what? Didn't do a thing to the good old beauty sleep. Well, what I mean to say is, I'd be awfully obliged if you'd let me bring him along." "Why, of course," said Mrs. Peagrim. "Any friend of yours, Mr. Rooke." "Thanks awfully. Special reason why I'd like him to come, and all that. He's a fellow named Underhill. Sir Derek Underhill. Been a pal of mine for years and years." Uncle Chris started. "Underhill? Is Derek Underhill in America?" "Landed this morning. Routed me out of bed at 7 o'clock." "Oh, do you know him too, Major Selby?" said Mrs. Peagrim. "Then I'm sure he must be charming." "Charming," began Uncle Chris in measured tones, "is an adjective which I cannot..." "Well, thanks most awfully," interrupted Freddie. "It's fearfully good of you to let me bring him along. I must be staggering off now. Lot of things to do." "Oh, must you go already?" "Absolutely must. Lots of things to do." Uncle Chris extended a hand to his hostess. "I think I'll be going along too, Mrs. Peagrim. I'll walk a few yards with you, Freddie, my boy. There are one or two things I would like to talk over. Till tonight, Mrs. Peagrim." "Till tonight, Major Selby." She turned to Mr. Pilkington as the door closed. "What charming manners Major Selby has. So polished. A sort of old world courtesy. So smooth." "Smooth," said Mr. Pilkington dourly, "is right." 2. Uncle Chris confronted Freddie sternly outside the front door. "What does this mean? Good God, Freddie, have you no delicacy?" "Eh?" said Freddie blankly. "Why are you bringing Underhill to this party? Don't you realize that poor Jill will be there? How do you suppose she will feel when she sees that blackguard again? The cad who threw her over and nearly broke her heart." Freddie's jaw fell. He groped for his fallen eyeglass. "Oh, my aunt, do you think she will be pipped?" "A sensitive girl like Jill?" "But listen, Derek wants to marry her." "What?" "Oh, absolutely. That's why he's come over." Uncle Chris shook his head. "I don't understand this. I saw the letter myself which he wrote to her, breaking off the engagement." "Yes, but he's dashed sorry about all that now. Wishes he had never been such a mug and all that sort of thing. As a matter of fact, that's why I shot over here in the first place. As an ambassador, don't you know. I told Jill all about it directly I saw her, but she seemed inclined to give it a miss rather, so I cabled old Derek to pop here in person. Seemed to me, don't you know, that Jill might be more likely to make it up and all that if she saw old Derek." Uncle Chris nodded, his composure restored. "Very true. Yes, certainly, my boy, you acted most sensibly. Badly as Underhill behaved, she undoubtedly loved him. It would be the best possible thing that could happen if they could be brought together. It is my dearest wish to see Jill comfortably settled. I was half hoping that she might marry young Pilkington." "Good God! The Pilker?" "He is quite a nice young fellow," argued Uncle Chris. "None too many brains, perhaps, but Jill would supply that deficiency. Still, of course, Underhill would be much better." "She ought to marry someone," said Freddie earnestly. "I mean, all rot a girl like Jill having to knock about and rough it like this." "You're perfectly right." "Of course," said Freddie thoughtfully, "the catch in the whole dashed business is that she's such a bally independent sort of girl. I mean to say, it's quite possible she may hand Derek the mitten, you know." "In that case, let us hope that she will look more favourably on young Pilkington." "Yes," said Freddie. "Well, yes, but, well, I wouldn't call the Pilker a very ripe sporting proposition. About 60 to 1 against is the way I should figure it if I were making book. It may be just because I'm feeling a bit pipped this morning. Got turfed out of bed at 7 o'clock and all that. But I have an idea that she may give both of 'em the old razz. May be wrong, of course." "Let us hope that you are, my boy," said Uncle Chris gravely. "For in that case I should be forced into a course of action from which I confess that I shrink." "I don't follow." "Freddie, my boy, you are a very old friend of Jill's, and I am her uncle. I feel that I can speak plainly to you. Jill is the dearest thing to me in the world. She trusted me, and I failed her. I was responsible for the loss of her money, and my one object in life is to see her by some means or other in a position equal to the one of which I deprived her. If she married a rich man, well and good. That, provided she marries him because she is fond of him, will be the very best thing that can happen. But if she does not, there is another way. It may be possible for me to marry a rich woman." Freddie stopped, appalled. "Good God, you don't mean... You aren't thinking of marrying Mrs. Peagrim?" "I wouldn't have mentioned names, but, as you have guessed, yes, if the worst comes to worst, I shall make the supreme sacrifice. Tonight will decide. Good-bye, my boy. I want to look in at my club for a few minutes. Tell Underhill that he has my best wishes."
"I'll bet he has," gasped Freddie. End of Chapter 19. Read by Don W. Jenkins. Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com. Chapter 20 of Jill the Reckless by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Derek loses one bird and secures another. It is safest for the historian, if he values accuracy, to wait till a thing has happened before writing about it. Otherwise he may commit himself to statements which are not borne out by the actual facts. Mrs. Peagrim, recording in advance the success of her party at the Gotham Theatre, had done this. It is true that she was a radiant and vivacious hostess, and it is possible, her standard not being very high, that she had never looked more charming. But when she went on to say that all present were in agreement that they had never spent a more delightful evening, she deceived the public. Uncle Chris for one, Otis Pilkington for another, and Freddie Rooke for a third, were so far from spending a delightful evening that they found it hard to mask their true emotions and keep a smiling face to the world. Otis Pilkington, indeed, found it impossible, and, ceasing to try, left early. Just 20 minutes after the proceedings had begun, he seized his coat and hat, shot out into the night, made off blindly up Broadway, and walked twice round Central Park before his feet gave out and he allowed himself to be taken back to his apartment in a taxi. Jill had been very kind and very sweet and very regretful, but it was only too manifest that on the question of becoming Mrs. Otis Pilkington her mind was made up. She was willing to like him, to be a sister to him, to watch his future progress with considerable interest, but she would not marry him. One feels sorry for Otis Pilkington in his hour of travail. This was the 5th or 6th time that this sort of thing had happened to him, and he was getting tired of it. If he could have looked into the future, 5 years almost to a day from that evening, and seen himself walking blushfully down the aisle of St. Thomas, with Roland Trevis' sister Angela on his arm, his gloom might have been lightened. More probably, however, it would have been increased. At the moment, Roland Trevis' sister Angela was 15, frivolous and freckled, and except that he rather disliked her and suspected her, correctly, of laughing at him, amounted to just nil in Mr. Pilkington's life. The idea of linking his lot and hers would have appalled him, enthusiastically though he was in favor of it 5 years later. However, Mr. Pilkington was unable to look into the future, so his reflections on this night of sorrow were not diverted from Jill. He thought sadly of Jill till 2:30, when he fell asleep in his chair and dreamed of her. At 7 o'clock, his Japanese valet, who had been given the night off, returned home, found him, and gave him breakfast. After which Mr. Pilkington went to bed, played 3 games of solitaire, and slept till dinner time, when he awoke to take up the burden of life again. He still brooded on the tragedy which had shattered him. Indeed, it was only 2 weeks later, when at a dance he was introduced to a red-haired girl from Detroit, that he really got over it. The news was conveyed to Freddie Rooke by Uncle Chris. Uncle Chris, with something of the emotions of a condemned man on the scaffold waiting for a reprieve, had watched Jill and Mr. Pilkington go off together into the dim solitude at the back of the orchestra chairs, and after an all too brief interval had observed the latter whizzing back, his every little movement having a meaning of its own, and that meaning one which convinced Uncle Chris that Freddie, in estimating Mr. Pilkington as a 60-to-1 chance, had not erred in his judgment of form. Uncle Chris found Freddie in one of the upper boxes, talking to Nellie Bryant. Dancing was going on down on the stage, but Freddie, though normally a young man who shook a skillful shoe, was in no mood for dancing tonight. The return to the scenes of his former triumphs and the meeting with the companions of happier days, severed from him by a 2 weeks' notice, had affected Freddie powerfully. Eyeing the happy throng below, he experienced the emotions of that Peri who, in the poem At the Gate of Eden, stood consolate. Excusing himself from Nellie and following Uncle Chris into the passageway outside the box, he heard the other's news listlessly. It came as no shock to Freddie. He had never thought Mr. Pilkington anything to write home about, and had never supposed that Jill would accept him. He said as much. Sorry for the chap in a way and all that, but never imagined for an instant that he would click. "Where's Underhill?" asked Uncle Chris, agitated.
Derek? Oh, he isn't here yet."
"But why isn't he here? I understood that you were bringing him with you."
"Oh, that was the scheme, but it seems that he had promised some people he met on the boat to go to a theatre and have a bit of supper with them afterwards. I only heard about it when I got back this morning."
"Good God, boy, didn't you tell him that Jill would be here tonight?"
"Oh, rather. And he's coming on directly he can get away from these people. Ought to be here any moment now."
Uncle Chris plucked his moustache gloomily. Freddie's detachment depressed him. He had looked for more animation and a greater sense of the importance of the issue.
"Well, pip pip for the present," said Freddie, moving toward the box. "Have to be getting back. See you later."
He disappeared, and Uncle Chris turned slowly to descend the stairs. As he reached the floor below, the door of the stage box opened, and Mrs. Peagrim came out.
"Oh, Major Selby!" cried the radiant and vivacious hostess. "I couldn't think where you had got to. I have been looking for you everywhere."
Uncle Chris quivered slightly, but braced himself to do his duty. "May I have the pleasure?" he began, then broke off as he saw the man who had come out of the box behind his hostess. "Underhill!" He grasped his hand and shook it warmly. "My dear fellow, I had no notion that you had arrived."
"Sir Derek came just a moment ago," said Mrs. Peagrim.
"How are you, Major Selby?" said Derek. He was a little surprised at the warmth of his reception. He had not anticipated this geniality. "My dear fellow, I'm delighted to see you," cried Uncle Chris. "But as I was saying, Mrs. Peagrim, may I have the pleasure of this dance?"
"I don't think I will dance this one," said Mrs. Peagrim surprisingly. "I am sure you two must have ever so much to talk about. Why don't you take Sir Derek and give him a cup of coffee?"
"Capital idea," said Uncle Chris. "Come this way, my dear fellow. As Mrs. Peagrim says, I have ever so much to talk about. Along this passage, my boy. Be careful. There's a step. Well, well, well. It's delightful to see you again." He massaged Derek's arm affectionately. Every time he had met Mrs. Peagrim that evening he had quailed inwardly at what lay before him. Should some hitch occur to prevent the reunion of Derek and Jill? And now that the other was actually here, handsomer than ever and more than ever the sort of man no girl could resist, he declined to admit the possibility of a hitch. His spirits soared. "You haven't seen Jill yet, of course?" "No." Derek hesitated. "Is Jill... does she... I mean...." Uncle Chris resumed his osteopathy. He kneaded his companion's coat sleeve with a jovial hand. "My dear fellow, of course, I am sure that a word or two from you will put everything right. We all make mistakes. I have made them myself. I am convinced that everything will be perfectly all right. Ah, there she is. Jill, my dear, here is an old friend to see you." 2. Since the hurried departure of Mr. Pilkington, Jill had been sitting in the auditorium, lazily listening to the music and watching the couples dancing on the stage. She found herself drifting into a mood of gentle contentment, and was at a loss to account for this. She was happy, quietly and peacefully happy, when she was aware that she ought to have been both agitated and apprehensive. When she had anticipated the recent interview with Otis Pilkington, which she had known was bound to come sooner or later, it had been shrinkingly and with foreboding. She hated hurting people's feelings, and, though she read Mr. Pilkington's character accurately enough to know that time would heal any anguish which she might cause him, she had had no doubt that the temperamental surface of that long young man, when he succeeded in getting her alone, was going to be badly bruised. And it had fallen out just as she had expected. Mr. Pilkington had said his say and departed, a pitiful figure, a spectacle which should have wrung her heart. It had not wrung her heart. Except for one fleeting instant when she was actually saying the fatal words, it had not interfered with her happiness at all. And already she was beginning to forget that the incident had ever happened. And if the past should have depressed her, the future might have been expected to depress her even more. There was nothing in it, either immediate or distant, which could account for her feeling gently contented. And yet, as she leaned back in her seat, her heart was dancing in time to the dance music of Mrs. Peagrim's hired orchestra. It puzzled Jill. And then, quite suddenly, yet with no abruptness or sense of discovery, just as if it were something which she had known all along, the truth came upon her. It was Wally. The thought of Wally, the knowledge that Wally existed, that made her happy. He was a solid, comforting, reassuring fact in a world of doubts and perplexities. She did not need to be with him to be fortified. It was enough just to think of him. Present or absent, his personality heartened her like fine weather or music or a sea breeze, or like that friendly, soothing nightlight which they used to leave in her nursery when she was little, to scare away the goblins and see her safely over the road that led to the gates of the city of dreams. Suppose there were no Wally? Jill gave a sudden gasp and sat up tingling. She felt as she had sometimes felt as a child, when on the edge of sleep she had dreamed that she was stepping off a precipice and had woken, tense and alert, to find that there was no danger after all. But there was a difference between that feeling and this. She had woken, but to find that there was danger. It was as though some inner voice was calling to her to be careful, to take thought. Suppose there were no Wally. And why should there always be Wally? He had said confidently enough that there would never be another girl. But there were thousands of other girls, millions of other girls, and could she suppose that one of them would not have the sense to snap up a treasure like Wally? A sense of blank desolation swept over Jill. Her quick imagination, leaping ahead, had made the vague possibility of a distant future an accomplished fact. She felt absurdly a sense of overwhelming loss. Into her mind, never far distant from it, came the thought of Derek. And suddenly Jill made another discovery. She was thinking of Derek, and it was not hurting. She was thinking of him quite coolly and clearly, and her heart was not aching. She sat back, screwed her eyes tight, as she had always done when puzzled. Something had happened to her, but how it had happened, and when it had happened, and why it had happened, she could not understand. She only knew that now for the first time she had been granted a moment of clear vision and was seeing things truly. She wanted Wally. She wanted him in the sense that she could not do without him. She felt nothing of the fiery tumult which had come upon her when she first met Derek. She and Wally would come together with a smile and build their life on an enduring foundation of laughter and happiness and good fellowship. Wally had never shaken and never would shake her senses as Derek had done. If that was love, then she did not love Wally. But her clear vision told her that it was not love. It might be the blazing and crackling of thorns, but it was not the fire. She wanted Wally. She needed him as she needed the air and the sunlight. She opened her eyes and saw Uncle Chris coming down the aisle toward her. There was a man with him, and as they moved closer in the dim light, Jill saw that it was Derek. "Jill, my dear," said Uncle Chris, "here's an old friend to see you." And, having achieved their bringing together, he proceeded to withdraw delicately whence he had come. It is pleasant to be able to record that he was immediately seized upon by Mrs. Peagrim, who had changed her mind about not dancing and led off to be her partner in a foxtrot, in the course of which she trod on his feet 3 times. "Why, Derek," said Jill cheerfully. Except for a mild wonder how he came to be there, she found herself wholly unaffected by the sight of him. "Whatever are you doing here?" Derek sat down beside her. The cordiality of her tone had relieved, yet at the same time disconcerted him. Man seldom attains to perfect contentment in this world, and Derek, while pleased that Jill apparently bore him no ill will, seemed to miss something in her manner which he would have been glad to find there. "Jill," he said huskily. It seemed to Derek only decent to speak huskily. To his orderly mind this situation could be handled only in one way. It was a plain, straight issue of the strong man humbling himself. Not too much, of course, but sufficiently, and it called, in his opinion, for the low voice, the clenched hand, and the broken whisper. Speaking as he had spoken, he had given the scene the right key from the start, or would have done if she had not got in ahead of him and opened it on a note of absurd cheeriness. Derek found himself resenting her cheeriness. Often as he had attempted during the voyage from England to visualize to himself this first meeting, he had never pictured Jill smiling brightly at him. It was a jolly smile and made her look extremely pretty, but it jarred upon him. A moment before he had been half relieved, half disconcerted. Now he was definitely disconcerted. He searched in his mind for a criticism of her attitude and came to the conclusion that what was wrong with it was that it was too friendly. Friendliness was well enough in its way, but in what should have been a tense clashing of strong emotions, it did not seem to Derek fitting. "Did you have a pleasant trip?" asked Jill.
Have you come over on business?"
A feeling of bewilderment came upon Derek. It was wrong. It was all wrong. Of course, she might be speaking like this to cloak intense feeling, but if so, she had certainly succeeded. From her manner, he and she might be casual acquaintances. A pleasant trip? In another minute she would be asking him how he had come out on the sweepstake on the ship's run. With a sense of putting his shoulder to some heavy weight and heaving at it, he sought to lift the conversation to a higher plane. "I came to find you," he said, still huskily, but not so huskily as before. There were degrees of huskiness, and Derek's was sharpened a little by a touch of irritation.
"Yes?" said Jill.
Derek was now fermenting. What she ought to have said he did not know, but he knew that it was not "yes." "Yes," in the circumstances, was almost as bad as "really?" There was a pause. Jill was looking at him with a frank and unembarrassed gaze which somehow deepened his sense of annoyance. Had she looked at him coldly, he could have understood and even appreciated it. He had been expecting coldness, and had braced himself to combat it. He was still not sure in his mind whether he was playing the role of a penitent or a King Cophetua, but in either character he might have anticipated a little temporary coldness, which it would have been his easy task to melt. But he had never expected to be looked at as if he were a specimen in a museum, and that was how he was feeling now. Jill was not looking at him. She was inspecting him, examining him, and he chafed under the process. Jill, unconscious of the discomfort she was causing, continued to gaze. She was trying to discover in just what respect he had changed from the god he had been. Certainly not in looks. He was as handsome as ever, handsomer indeed, for the sunshine and clean breezes of the Atlantic had given him an exceedingly becoming coat of tan. And yet he must have changed, for now she could look upon him quite dispassionately and criticize him without a tremor. It was like seeing a copy of a great painting. Everything was there, except the one thing that mattered, the magic and the glamour. It was like... She suddenly remembered a scene in the dressing room when the company had been in Baltimore. Lois Denham, duly the recipient of the sunburst which her friend Izzy had promised her, had unfortunately, in a spirit of girlish curiosity, taken it to a jeweler to be priced, and the jeweler had blasted her young life by declaring it a paste imitation. Jill recalled how the stricken girl, previous to calling Izzy on the long distance and telling him a number of things which, while probably not news to him, must have been painful hearing, had passed the vile object round the dressing room for inspection. The imitation was perfect. It had been impossible for the girls to tell that the stones were not real diamonds. Yet the jeweler, with his sixth sense, had seen through them in a trifle under 10 seconds. Jill came to the conclusion that her newly discovered love for Wally Mason had equipped her with a sixth sense, and that by its aid she was really for the first time seeing Derek as he was. Derek had not the privilege of being able to read Jill's thoughts. All he could see was the outer Jill, and the outer Jill, as she had always done, was stirring his emotions. Her daintiness afflicted him. Not for the first, the second, or the third time since they had come into each other's lives, he was astounded at the strength of the appeal which Jill had for him when they were together, as contrasted with its weakness when they were apart. He made another attempt to establish the scene on a loftier plane. "What a fool I was!" he sighed. "Jill, can you ever forgive me?" He tried to take her hand. Jill skillfully eluded him.
"Why, of course I've forgiven you, Derek, if there was anything to forgive."
Anything to forgive? Derek began to get into his stride. These were the lines in which he had desired the interview to develop. "I was a brute, a cad."
"Oh, no."
"I was. Oh, I have been through hell." Jill turned her head away. She did not want to hurt him, but nothing could have kept her from smiling. She had been so sure that he would say that sooner or later. "Jill!" Derek had misinterpreted the cause of her movement and had attributed it to emotion. "Tell me that everything is as it was before." Jill turned.
"I'm afraid I can't say that, Derek."
"Of course not," agreed Derek, in a comfortable glow of manly remorse. He liked himself in the character of the strong man abashed. "It would be too much to expect, I know. But when we are married..."
"Do you really want to marry me?"
"Jill!"
"I wonder."
"How can you doubt it?" Jill looked at him.
"Have you thought what it would mean?"
"What would it mean?"
"Well, your mother."
"Oh!" Derek dismissed Lady Underhill with a grand gesture.
"Yes," persisted Jill. "But if she disapproved of your marrying me before, wouldn't she disapprove a good deal more now, when I haven't a penny in the world and am just in the chorus?"
A sort of strangled sound proceeded from Derek's throat. "In the chorus?"
"Didn't you know? I thought Freddie must have told you."
"In the chorus?" Derek stammered. "I thought you were here as a guest of Mrs. Peagrim's."
"So I am, like all the rest of the company."
But...
"You see, it would be bound to make everything a little difficult," said Jill. Her face was grave, but her lips were twitching. "I mean, you are rather a prominent man, aren't you? And if you married a chorus girl...."
"Nobody would know," said Derek limply.
Jill opened her eyes. "Nobody would know," she laughed. "But of course you've never met our press agent. If you think that nobody would know that a girl in the company had married a baronet who was a member of Parliament and expected to be in the Cabinet in a few years, you're wronging him. The news would be on the front page of all the papers the very next day, columns of it with photographs. There would be articles about it in the Sunday papers, illustrated, and then it would be cabled to England and would appear in the papers there. You see, you're a very important person, Derek." Derek sat clutching the arms of his chair. His face was chalky. Though he had never been inclined to underestimate his importance as a figure in the public eye, he had overlooked the disadvantages connected with such an eminence. He gurgled wordlessly. He had been prepared to brave Lady Underhill's wrath and assert his right to marry whom he pleased, but this was different. Jill watched him curiously and with a certain pity. It was so easy to read what was passing in his mind. She wondered what he would say, how he would flounder out of his unfortunate position. She had no illusions about him now. She did not even contemplate the possibility of chivalry winning the battle which was going on within him. "It would be very awkward, wouldn't it?" she said. And then pity had its way with Jill. He had treated her badly. For a time she had thought that he had crushed all the heart out of her. But he was suffering, and she hated to see anybody suffer. "I'm engaged to somebody else."
As a suffocating man, his lips to the tube of oxygen, gradually comes back to life, Derek revived. Slowly, as the meaning of her words sank into his mind, then with a sudden abruptness. "What?" he cried.
"I'm going to marry somebody else, a man named Wally Mason."
Derek swallowed. The chalky look died out of his face, and he flushed hotly. His eyes, half relieved, half indignant, glowed under their penthouse of eyebrow. He sat for a moment in silence. "I think you might have told me before," he said huffily.
Jill laughed. "Yes, I suppose I ought to have told you before."
"Leading me on."
Jill patted him on the arm. "Never mind, Derek. It's all over now. And it was great fun, wasn't it?"
"Fun?"
"Shall we go and dance? The music is just starting."
"I won't dance." Jill got up.
"I must," she said. "I'm so happy I can't keep still. Well, good-bye, Derek. In case I don't see you again, it was nice meeting after all this time. You haven't altered a bit."
Derek watched her flit down the aisle, saw her jump up the little ladder onto the stage, watched her vanish into the swirl of the dance. He reached for a cigarette, opened his case, and found it empty. He uttered a mirthless, Byronic laugh. The thing seemed to him symbolic. 3. Not having a cigarette of his own, Derek got up and went to look for the only man he knew who could give him one, and after a search of a few minutes came upon Freddie all alone in a dark corner apart from the throng. It was a very different Freddie from the moody youth who had returned to the box after his conversation with Uncle Chris. He was leaning against a piece of scenery with his head tilted back and a beam of startled happiness on his face. So wrapped was he in his reflections that he did not become aware of Derek's approach until the latter spoke. "Got a cigarette, Freddie?" Freddie withdrew his gaze from the roof. "Hello there, old son. Cigarette? Certainly, and by all means. Cigarettes? Where are the cigarettes? Mr. Rooke, forward. Show cigarettes." He extended his case to Derek, who helped himself in somber silence, finding his boyhood's friend's exuberance hard to bear. "I say, Derek, old scream, the most extraordinary thing has happened. You'll never guess. To cut a long story short and come to the blowout of the scenario, I'm engaged. Engaged, old crumpet. You know what I mean, engaged to be married." "Ugh," said Derek gruffly, frowning over his cigarette. "Don't wonder you're surprised," said Freddie, looking at him a little wistfully, for his friend had scarcely been gushing, and he would have welcomed a bit of enthusiasm. "Can hardly believe it myself." Derek awoke to a sense of the conventions. "Congratulate you," he said. "Do I know her?" "Not yet, but you will soon. She's a girl in the company. In the chorus, as a matter of fact. Girl named Nellie Bryant. An absolute corker. I'll go further. A topper. You'll like her, old man." Derek was looking at him amazed. "Good heavens!" he said. "Extraordinary how these things happen," proceeded Freddie. "Looking back, I can see, of course, that I always thought her a topper, but the idea of getting engaged, I don't know, sort of thing that doesn't occur to a chappie, if you know what I mean. What I mean to say is, we had always been the greatest of pals and all that, but it never struck me that she would think it much of a wheeze getting hooked up for life with a chap like me. We just sort of drifted along and so forth, all very jolly and what not. And then this evening, I don't know, I had a bit of a hump, what with one thing and another, and she was most dashed sweet and patient and soothing and well, and what not, don't you know, and suddenly, deuced rummy sensation, the jolly old scales seemed to fall, if you follow me, from my good old eyes. I don't know if you get the idea. I suddenly seemed to look myself squarely in the eyeball and say to myself, 'Freddie, old top, how do we go? Are we not missing a good thing?' And by Jove, thinking it over, I found I was absolutely correcto. You've no notion how dashed sympathetic she is, old man. I mean to say, I had this hump, you know, owing to one thing and another, and was feeling that life was more or less of a jolly old snare and delusion. And she bucked me up and all that, and suddenly I found myself kissing her and all that sort of rot, and she was kissing me and so on and so forth, and she's got the most ripping eyes, and there was nobody about, and the long and the short of it was, old boy, that I said, 'Let's get married,' and she said, 'When?' And that was that, if you see what I mean. The scheme now is to pop down to the City Hall and get a license, which it appears you have to have if you want to bring this sort of binge off with any success and vim. And then what ho for the padre! Looking at it from every angle, a bit of good egg, what? Happiest man in the world and all that sort of thing." At this point in his somewhat incoherent epic, Freddie paused. It had occurred to him that he had perhaps laid himself open to a charge of monopolizing the conversation. "I say, you'll forgive my dwelling a bit on this thing, won't you? Never found a girl who would look twice at me before, and it's rather unsettled the old bean. Just occurred to me that I may have been talking about my own affairs a bit. Your turn now, old thing. Sit down, as the blighters in the novels used to say, and tell me the story of your life. You've seen Jill, of course?" "Yes," said Derek shortly. "And it's all right, eh? Fine. We'll make a double wedding of it, what? Not a bad idea, that. I mean to say, the man of God might make a reduction for quantity and shade his fee a bit. Do the job half price." Derek threw down the end of his cigarette and crushed it with his heel. A closer observer than Freddie would have detected long ere this the fact that his demeanor was not that of a happy and successful wooer. "Jill and I are not going to be married," he said. A look of blank astonishment came into Freddie's cheerful face. He could hardly believe that he had heard correctly. It is true that, in gloomier mood, he had hazarded the theory to Uncle Chris that Jill's independence might lead her to refuse Derek, but he had not really believed in the possibility of such a thing, even at the time. And now, in the full flood of optimism consequent on his own engagement, it seemed even more incredible. "Great Scott!" he cried. "Did she give you the raspberry?" It is to be doubted whether the pride of the Underhills would have permitted Derek to reply in the affirmative, even if Freddie had phrased his question differently. But the brutal directness of the query made such a course impossible for him. Nothing was dearer to Derek than his self-esteem, and even at the expense of the truth he was resolved to shield it from injury. To face Freddie and confess that any girl in the world had given him, Derek Underhill, what he coarsely termed the raspberry, was a task so revolting as to be utterly beyond his powers. "Nothing of the kind," he snapped. "It was because we both saw that the thing would be impossible. Why didn't you tell me that Jill was in the chorus of this damn piece?" Freddie's mouth slowly opened. He was trying not to realize the meaning of what his friend was saying. His was a faithful soul, and for years, to all intents and purposes for practically the whole of his life, he had looked up to Derek and reverenced him. He absolutely refused to believe that Derek was intending to convey what he seemed to be trying to convey. For if he was, well, by Jove, it was too rotten, and Algy Martin had been right after all, and the fellow was simply... "You don't mean, old man," said Freddie with an almost pleading note in his voice, "that you're going to back out of marrying Jill because she's in the chorus?" Derek looked away and scowled. He was finding Freddie, in the capacity of an inquisitor, as trying as he had found him in the role of exuberant fiancé. It offended his pride to have to make explanations to one whom he had always regarded with a patronizing tolerance as not a bad fellow in his way, but in every essential respect negligible. "I have to be sensible," he said, chafing as the indignity of his position intruded itself more and more. "You know what it would mean." Paragraphs in all the papers. Photographs. The news cabled to England. Everybody reading it and misunderstanding. I've got my career to think of. It would cripple me." His voice trailed off, and there was silence for a moment. Then Freddie burst into speech. His good-natured face was hard with unwonted scorn. Its cheerful vacuity had changed to stony contempt. For the second time in the evening the jolly old scales had fallen from Freddie's good old eyes, and, as Jill had done, he saw Derek as he was. "My sainted aunt," he said slowly. "So that's it, what? Well, I've always thought a dashed lot of you, as you know. I've always looked up to you as a bit of a nib and wished I was like you. But great Scott! If that's the sort of chap you are, I'm deuced glad I'm not. I'm going to wake up in the middle of the night and think how unlike you I am and pat myself on the back. Ronnie Devereux was perfectly right. A tick's a tick, and that's all there is to say about it. Good old Ronnie told me what you were, and like a silly ass, I wasted a lot of time trying to make him believe you weren't that sort of chap at all. It's no good standing there looking like your mother," said Freddie firmly. "This is where we jolly well part brass rags. If we ever meet again, I'll trouble you not to speak to me, because I've a reputation to keep up. So there you have it in a bally nutshell." Scarcely had Freddie ceased to administer it to his former friend in a bally nutshell when Uncle Chris, warm and dishevelled from the dance as interpreted by Mrs. Waddesleigh Peagrim, came bustling up, saving Derek the necessity of replying to the harangue. "Well, Underhill, my dear fellow," began Chris affably, attaching himself to the other's arm. "What—" He broke off, for Derek, freeing his arm with a wrench, turned and walked rapidly away. Derek had no desire to go over the whole thing again with Uncle Chris. He wanted to be alone, to build up, painfully and laboriously, the ruins of his self-esteem. The pride of the Underhills had had a bad evening. Uncle Chris turned to Freddie. "What is the matter?" he asked blankly. "I'll tell you what's the jolly old matter," cried Freddie. "The blighter isn't going to marry poor Jill after all. He's changed his rotten mind. It's off." "Off?" "Absolutely off." "Absolutely off?" "Napoo," said Freddie. "He's afraid of what will happen to his blasted career if he marries a girl who's been in the chorus." "But, my dear boy," Uncle Chris blinked. "But, my dear boy, this is ridiculous. Surely, if I were to speak a word—" "You can if you like. I wouldn't speak to the man again if you paid me. But it won't do any good, so what's the use?" Slowly Uncle Chris adjusted his mind to the disaster. "Then you mean—" "It's off," said Freddie. For a moment Uncle Chris stood motionless. Then, with a sudden jerk, he seemed to stiffen his backbone. His face was bleak, but he pulled at his moustache jauntily. "Morituri te salutant," he said. "Good-bye, Freddie, my boy." He turned away, gallant and upright, the old soldier. "Where are you going?" asked Freddie. "Over the top," said Uncle Chris. "What do you mean?" "I am going," said Uncle Chris steadily, "to find Mrs. Peagrim." "Good God!" cried Freddie. He followed him, protesting weakly, but the other gave no sign that he had heard. Freddie saw him disappear into the stage box, and, turning, found Jill at his elbow.
"Where did Uncle Chris go?" asked Jill. "I want to speak to him."
"He's in the stage box with Mrs. Peagrim."
"With Mrs. Peagrim?"
"Proposing to her," said Freddie solemnly.
Jill stared.
"Proposing to Mrs. Peagrim? What do you mean?"
Freddie drew her aside and began to explain. 4. In the dimness of the stage box, his eyes a little glassy and a dull despair in his soul, Uncle Chris was wondering how to begin. In his hot youth he had been rather a devil of a fellow in between dances, a cooer of soft phrases and a stealer of never very stoutly withheld kisses. He remembered one time in Bangalore, but that had nothing to do with the case. The point was, how to begin with Mrs. Peagrim. The fact that 25 years ago he had crushed in his arms beneath the shadows of the deodars a girl whose name he had forgotten, though he remembered that she had worn a dress of some pink stuff, was immaterial and irrelevant. Was he to crush Mrs. Peagrim in his arms? Not, thought Uncle Chris to himself, on a bet. He contented himself for the moment with bending an intense gaze upon her and asking if she was tired. "A little," panted Mrs. Peagrim, who, though she danced often and vigorously, was never in the best of condition, owing to her habit of neutralizing the beneficent effects of exercise by surreptitious candy-eating. "I'm a little out of breath." Uncle Chris had observed this for himself, and it had not helped him to face his task. lovely woman loses something of her queenly dignity when she puffs. Inwardly, he was thinking how exactly his hostess resembled the third from the left of a troupe of performing sea lions, which he had seen some years ago on one of his rare visits to a vaudeville house. "You ought not to tire yourself," he said with a difficult tenderness. "I am so fond of dancing," pleaded Mrs. Peagrim. Recovering some of her breath, she gazed at her companion with a sort of short-winded archness. "You are always so sympathetic, Major Selby." "Am I?" said Uncle Chris. "Am I?"
"You know you are."
Uncle Chris swallowed quickly. "I wonder if you have ever wondered," he began, and stopped. He felt that he was not putting it as well as he might. "I wonder if it has ever struck you that there is a reason." He stopped again. He seemed to remember reading something like that in an advertisement in a magazine, and he did not want to talk like an advertisement. "I wonder if it has ever struck you, Mrs. Peagrim," he began again, "that any sympathy on my part might be due to some deeper emotion which... Have you never suspected that you have never suspected?" Uncle Chris began to feel that he must brace himself up. Usually a man of fluent speech, he was not at his best tonight. He was just about to try again when he caught his hostess' eye, and the soft gleam in it sent him cowering back into the silence as if he were taking cover from an enemy's shrapnel. Mrs. Peagrim touched him on the arm.
"You were saying?"
she murmured encouragingly. Uncle Chris shut his eyes. His fingers pressed desperately into the velvet curtain beside him. He felt as he had felt when a raw lieutenant in India during his first hill campaign, when the etiquette of the service had compelled him to rise and walk up and down in front of his men under a desultory shower of jezail bullets. He seemed to hear the damn things whop-whopping now, and almost wished that he could really hear them. One or two good bullets just now would be a welcome diversion.
"Yes?" said Mrs. Peagrim.
"Have you never felt," babbled Uncle Chris, "that feeling as I feel I might have felt, that is to say, might be feeling a feeling?" There was a tap at the door of the box. Uncle Chris started violently. Jill came in.
"Oh, I beg your pardon," she said. "I wanted to speak."
"You wanted to speak to me?" said Uncle Chris, bounding up. "Certainly, certainly, certainly. Of course, if you will excuse me for a moment." Mrs. Peagrim bowed coldly. The interruption had annoyed her. She had no notion who Jill was, and she resented the intrusion at this particular juncture intensely. Not so Uncle Chris, who skipped out into the passage like a young lamb.
"Am I in time?" asked Jill in a whisper.
"In time?"
"You know what I mean, Uncle Chris. Listen to me. You are not to propose to that awful woman. Do you understand?"
Uncle Chris shook his head. "The die is cast."
"The die isn't anything of the sort," said Jill. "Unless..." She stopped aghast. "You don't mean that you have done it already?"
"Well, no. To be perfectly accurate, no, but..."
"Then that's all right. I don't know why you were doing it, and it was very sweet of you, but you mustn't."
"But, Jill, you don't understand."
"I do understand."
"I have a motive."
"I know your motive. Freddie told me. Don't you worry yourself about me, dear, because I am all right. I am going to be married."
A look of ecstatic relief came into Uncle Chris's face. "Then Underhill?"
"I am not marrying Derek. Somebody else. I don't think you know him, but I love him, and so will you." She pulled his face down and kissed him. "Now you can go back."
Uncle Chris was almost too overcome to speak. He gulped a little. "Jill," he said shakily, this is a great relief."
"I knew it would be."
"If you are really going to marry a rich man..."
"I didn't say he was rich."
The joy ebbed from Uncle Chris's face. "If he is not rich, if he cannot give you everything of which I..."
"Oh, don't be absurd. Wally has all the money anybody needs. What's money?"
"What's money?" Uncle Chris stared. "Money, my dear child, is... Well, you mustn't talk of it in that light way. But if you think you will really have enough..."
"Of course we shall. Now you can go back. Mrs. Peagrim will be wondering what has become of you."
"Must I?" said Uncle Chris doubtfully.
"Of course. You must be polite."
"Very well," said Uncle Chris. "But it will be a little difficult to continue the conversation on what you might call general lines. However..." Back in the box, Mrs. Peagrim was fanning herself with manifest impatience.
"What did that girl want?" she demanded.
Uncle Chris seated himself with composure. The weakness had passed, and he was himself again. "Oh, nothing, nothing. Some trivial difficulty which I was able to dispose of in a few words." Mrs. Peagrim would have liked to continue her researches, but a feeling that it was wiser not to stray too long from the main point restrained her. She bent toward him.
"You were going to say something when that girl interrupted us."
Uncle Chris shot his cuffs with a debonair gesture. Was I? Was I? To be sure, yes. I was saying that you ought not to let yourself get tired. Deuce of a thing getting tired. Plays the dickens with the system." Mrs. Peagrim was disconcerted. The atmosphere seemed to have changed, and she did not like it. She endeavoured to restore the tone of the conversation.
"You are so sympathetic," she sighed, feeling that she could not do better than to begin again at that point. The remark had produced good results before, and it might do so a second time.
"Yes," agreed Uncle Chris cheerily. "You see, I have seen something of all this sort of thing, and I realize the importance of it. I know what all this modern rush and strain of life is for a woman in your position. Parties every night, dancing, 1,001 calls on the vitality. Bound to have an effect sooner or later. Unless, said Uncle Chris solemnly, one takes steps. Unless one acts in time. I had a friend," his voice sank, "I had a very dear friend over in London, Lady Alice, but the name would convey nothing. The point is that she was in exactly the same position as you. On the rush all the time. Never stopped. The end was inevitable. She caught cold, hadn't sufficient vitality to throw it off, went to a dance in midwinter, contracted pneumonia." Uncle Chris sighed. "All over in 3 days," he said sadly. "Now at that time," he resumed, "I did not know what I know now. If I had heard of Nervino then," he shook his head, "it might have saved her life. It would have saved her life. I tell you, Mrs. Peagrim, that there is no lack of vitality which Nervino cannot set right. I am no physician myself. I speak as a layman, but it acts on the red corpuscles of the blood." Mrs. Peagrim's face was stony. She had not spoken before, because he had given her no opportunity, but she spoke now in a hard voice. "Major Selby." "Mrs. Peagrim?"
"I am not interested in patent medicines."
"One can hardly call Nervino that," said Uncle Chris reproachfully. "It's a sovereign specific. You can get it at any drug store. It comes in 2 sizes, the $1.50 or large size, and the..." Mrs. Peagrim rose majestically.
"Major Selby, I am tired."
"Precisely, and as I say, Nervino..."
"Please," said Mrs. Peagrim coldly, "go to the stage door and see if you can find my limousine. I shall be waiting in the street."
"Certainly," said Uncle Chris. "Why, certainly." He left the box and proceeded across the stage. He walked with a lissom jauntiness. His eye was bright. One or two of those whom he passed on his way had the idea that this fine-looking man was in pain. They fancied that he was moaning. But Uncle Chris was not moaning. He was humming a gay snatch from the lighter music of the 90s. End of Chapter 20. Read by Don W. Jenkins. Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com. Chapter 21 of Jill the Reckless by P.G. Wodehouse. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Don W. Jenkins. Wally Mason learns a new exercise. 1. Up on the roof of his apartment, far above the bustle and clamor of the busy city, Wally Mason, at 11 o'clock on the morning after Mrs. Peagrim's bohemian party, was greeting the new day, as was his custom, by going through his ante-breakfast exercises. Mankind is divided into 2 classes: those who do setting-up exercises before breakfast, and those who know they ought to, but don't. To the former and more praiseworthy class Wally had belonged since boyhood. Life might be vain and the world a void, but still he touched his toes the prescribed number of times and twisted his muscular body about according to the ritual. He did so this morning a little more vigorously than usual, partly because he had sat up too late the night before and thought too much and smoked too much, with the result that he had risen heavy-eyed at the present disgraceful hour, and partly because he hoped by wearying the flesh to still the restlessness of the spirit. Spring generally made Wally restless, but never previously had it brought him this distracted feverishness. So he lay on his back and waved his legs in the air, and it was only when he had risen and was about to go still further into the matter that he perceived Jill standing beside him. "Good Lord!" said Wally.
"Don't stop," said Jill. "I'm enjoying it."
"How long have you been here?"
"Oh, I only just arrived. I rang the bell, and the nice old lady who is cooking your lunch told me you were out here."
"Not lunch. Breakfast."
"Breakfast? At this hour?"
"Won't you join me?"
"I'll join you, but I had my breakfast long ago."
Wally found his despondency magically dispelled. It was extraordinary how the mere sight of Jill could make the world a different place. It was true the sun had been shining before her arrival, but in a flabby, weak-minded way, not with the brilliance it had acquired immediately he heard her voice. "If you don't mind waiting for about 3 minutes while I have a shower and dress."
"Oh, is the entertainment over?" asked Jill, disappointed. "I always arrive too late for everything."
"One of these days you shall see me go through the whole program, including shadow boxing and the goose step. Bring your friends. But at the moment I think it would be more of a treat for you to watch me eat an egg. Go and look at the view. From over there you can see Hoboken."
"I've seen it. I don't think much of it."
"Well, then, on this side we have Brooklyn. There is no stint. Wander to and fro and enjoy yourself. The rendezvous is in the sitting room in about 4 moments." Wally vaulted through the passage window and disappeared. Then he returned and put his head out. "I say."
"Yes?"
"Just occurred to me. Your uncle won't be wanting this place for half an hour or so, will he? I mean, there will be time for me to have a bite of breakfast."
"I don't suppose he will require your little room till some time in the evening."
"Fine." Wally disappeared again, and a few moments later Jill heard the faint splashing of water. She walked to the parapet and looked down. On the windows of the nearer buildings the sun cast glittering beams, but further away a faint translucent mist hid the city. There was spring humidity in the air. In the street she had found it oppressive, but on the breezy summit of this steel and granite cliff the air was cool and exhilarating. Peace stole into Jill's heart as she watched the boats dropping slowly down the East River, which gleamed like dull steel through the haze. She had come to journey's end, and she was happy. Trouble and heartache seemed as distant as those hurrying black ants down on the streets. She felt far away from the world on an enduring mountain of rest. She gave a little sigh of contentment and turned to go in as Wally called. In the sitting room her feeling of security deepened. Here the world was farther away than ever. Even the faint noises which had risen to the roof were inaudible, and only the cosy tick-tock of the grandfather's clock punctuated the stillness. She looked at Wally with a quickening sense of affection. He had the divine gift of silence at the right time. Yes, this was home. This was where she belonged.
"It didn't take me in, you know,"
said Jill at length, resting her arms on the table and regarding him severely. Wally looked up. "What didn't take you in?"
"That bath of yours. Yes, I know you turned on the cold shower, but you stood at a safe distance and watched it show."
Wally waved his fork. "As heaven is my witness, look at my hair, still damp, and I can show you the towel."
"Well, then, I'll bet it was the hot water. Why weren't you at Mrs. Peagrim's party last night?"
"It would take too long to explain all my reasons, but one of them was that I wasn't invited. How did it go off?"
"Splendidly. Freddie's engaged."
Wally lowered his coffee cup. "Engaged? You don't mean what is sometimes slangily called betrothed?"
"I do. He's engaged to Nellie Bryant. Nellie told me all about it when she got home last night. It seems that Freddie said to her, 'What ho!' and she said, 'You bet!' and Freddie said, 'Pip, pip!' and the thing was settled," Jill bubbled. "Freddie wants to go into vaudeville with her."
"No. The Juggling Rookes, or Rooke and Bryant? The cross-talk team, a thoroughly refined act, swell dressers on and off?"
"I don't know. But it doesn't matter. Nellie is domestic. She's going to have a little home in the country where she can grow chickens and pigs."
"Father's in the pigsty. You can tell by his hat, eh?"
"Yes, they will be very happy. Freddie will be a father to her parrot."
Wally's cheerfulness diminished a trifle. The contemplation of Freddie's enviable lot brought with it the inevitable contrast with his own. A little home in the country. Oh, well. 2. There was a pause. Jill was looking a little grave.
"Wally?"
"Yes?" She turned her face away, for there was a gleam of mischief in her eyes which she did not wish him to observe.
"Derek was at the party."
Wally had been about to butter a piece of toast. The butter, jerked from the knife by the convulsive start which he gave, popped up in a semicircle and plumped onto the tablecloth. He recovered himself quickly. "Sorry," he said. "You mustn't mind that. They want me to be second string for the Boosting the Butter event at the next Olympic Games, and I'm practicing all the time. Underhill was there, eh?"
"Yes."
"You met him?"
"Yes."
Wally fiddled with his knife. "Did he come over? I mean, had he come specially to see you?"
"Yes."
"I see." There was another pause. "He wants to marry you?"
"He said he wanted to marry me."
Wally got up and went to the window. Jill could smile safely now, and she did, but her voice was still grave.
"What ought I to do, Wally? I thought I would ask you, as you are such a friend."
Wally spoke without turning. "You ought to marry him, of course."
"You think so?"
"You ought to marry him, of course," said Wally doggedly. "You love him, and the fact that he came all the way to America must mean that he still loves you. Marry him."
"But," Jill hesitated, "you see, there's a difficulty."
"What difficulty?"
"Well, it was something I said to him just before he went away. I said something that made it a little difficult."
Wally continued to inspect the roofs below. "What did you say?"
"Well, it was something that I said I don't believe he liked. Something that may interfere with his marrying me."
"What did you say?"
"I told him I was going to marry you."
Wally spun around. At the same time he leaped in the air. The effect of the combination of movements was to cause him to stagger across the room, and after 2 or 3 impromptu dance steps, which would have interested Mrs. Peagrim, to clutch the mantelpiece to save himself from falling. Jill watched him with quiet approval.
"Why, that's wonderful, Wally. Is that another of your morning exercises? If Freddie goes into vaudeville, you ought to get him to let you join the troupe."
Wally was blinking at her from the mantelpiece. "Jill!"
"Yes?"
What...
"Now, don't talk like Freddie, even if you are going into vaudeville with him."
"You said you were going to marry me?"
"I said I was going to marry you."
"But do you mean...?" The mischief died out of Jill's eyes. She met his gaze frankly and seriously.
"The lumber's gone, Wally," she said, "but my heart isn't empty. It's quite full. And it's going to be full for ever and ever and ever."
Wally left the mantelpiece and came slowly towards her.
"Jill!" he choked. "Jill!"
Suddenly he pounced on her and swung her off her feet. She gave a little breathless cry.
"Wally, I thought you didn't approve of cavemen."
"This," said Wally, "is just another new morning exercise I've thought of." Jill sat down, gasping.
"Are you going to do that often, Wally?"
"Every day for the rest of my life."
"Goodness!"
"Oh, you'll get used to it. It'll grow on you."
"You don't think I'm making a mistake marrying you?"
No. I've given the matter a lot of thought and, in fact, no."
"No," said Jill thoughtfully. "I think you'll make a good husband. I mean, suppose we ever want the piano moved or something. Wally," she broke off suddenly.
"You have our ear."
"Come out on the roof," said Jill. "I want to show you something funny."
Wally followed her out. They stood at the parapet together, looking down.
"There," said Jill, pointing.
Wally looked puzzled. "I see many things, but which is the funny one?"
"Why, all these people, over there and there and there, scuttering about and thinking they know everything there is to know, and not one of them has the least idea that I am the happiest girl on earth."
"Or that I'm the happiest man. Their ignorance is, what is the word I want? Abysmal. They don't know what it's like to stand beside you and see that little dimple in your chin. They don't know that you've got a little dimple in your chin. They don't know. Why, I don't suppose a single one of them even knows that I'm just going to kiss you."
"Those girls in the window over there do," said Jill. "They are watching us like hawks."
"Let 'em," said Wally briefly. End of Chapter 21. End of Jill the Reckless by P.G. Wodehouse. Read by Don W. Jenkins. Rancho San Diego, California. shaggybark.blogspot.com